G'day mates, it's Busta here, and I would like to give a big shout out to Causebox for sponsoring this episode. So, I think my girl may have just discovered her new favourite subscription. It's called Causebox, and I would love to tell you guys about it. So Causebox is a quarterly, 4 times per year, subscription box curated by women for women that is filled with all sorts of amazing products and brands that are ethical, sustainable, and have a positive mission to give back and make the world a better place, which I really like. Every Causebox is a limited edition and comes with 6 to 8 full-size products. You can get everything from skincare and jewelry to homewares and accessories. The last 4 boxes sold out within days as well, which I can actually believe because you get over $250 worth of products for only $50. My girl absolutely loved her Causebox as well. Her most recent box included a jade face roller, a modern bento box, a portfolio clutch and insulated tumbler, as well as some other cool items as well. It also came with this really cool magazine that details the story and the mission behind each product within the box, which I thought was a really nice touch. My wife said that one of the best parts was just getting the Causebox in the mail. They ship it to you for free, in fact, opening it and feeling like she got herself a huge surprise bundle of gifts. It would make a really good birthday gift, a Valentine gift, Christmas gift as well, and I'd also get this for my mum, my sister, my friends too, because it's a really fantastic subscription. And the best part is that, of course, I got you guys an exclusive discount. All you have to do is go to causebox.com/BeScared and use the code BeScared to get your first box for 30% off, as in, you can get your first box worth over $250 plus for less than $39. So go check out Causebox right now. I can tell you firsthand that I think you're going to love it. Once again, that's go to causebox.com/BESCARED and use the promo code BESCARED to get your first box for 30% off. I live in Colorado, and the Rocky Mountain National Park is pretty close to me. I'm pretty outdoorsy, and so I tend to walk and hike all over my beautiful state. Usually just do day trips or 24-hour stays outdoors, stuff like that. Quick campfires and small meals. Me and my dog mostly. So I was hiking just last fall in Grand Lake, a trail called Tonahutu Creek. It was about 1:45 in the afternoon. A dog wasn't with me at the time because they're not allowed on these trails, so it was just me and myself. I was walking southeast when suddenly the area went completely silent. No wind, no animals, not even the smell of the outdoors. It's like I sort of walked into a bubble where nothing existed or where everything was muted. I took out my phone to check the time and it was just after 3:45. Though it seemed like there was a weird fog around me as well. I kept walking, the silence still there, the odd feeling too. I walked for another good 10-15 minutes when I turned my attention to the sky, and the clouds seemed to be moving rapidly as if a storm was coming. The forecast didn't call for any rain or snow that day, so it was odd to see low-hanging clouds that were moving so rapidly, almost as if I was viewing a time-lapse of a video. But then I heard a rumble that came from the ground. It was emanating from what I assume was deep below. Sort of a large crack that sounded like thunder ended the rumble. The clouds stopped moving quickly, but had a very light pink or purple tinge to them. At this point, I was speedwalking, trying to get out of there. My fight or flight response seemed to have kicked in, and my adrenaline was now pumping. The odd feeling to my gut turned to complete terror, and yet there was nothing around me that should invoke that sort of fear. There was no wildlife, no bears, no mountain lions. Then, another crack and a flash of light later, everything just seemed to go back to normal. The wind returned, the birds that filled the air with sound was now replaced with the sound of crickets, and the strangest thing was that it was now 6:30 p.m. I was already on my way back to the truck before this all happened, but it should not have taken me that long to get back to the trailhead like that. It only seemed like 15 minutes had passed, and yet more than 4 hours had elapsed. I have no recollection of what happened in that time either, besides what I've shared with you guys, obviously. I've only really shared this with a few people as well. Some said that I was abducted, others said that I entered a time slip or something, but truthfully, I have no idea what happened. Either way, though, I just wanted to share this to get it off my chest. This happened when I was in college about 6 years ago. At around 5:30 p.m. after class, I just said goodbye to my friend as we made our separate ways going home when a guy in a hoodie blocked my way. The moment the guy was in front of me, he hugged me and grabbed my head close to his chest. He also slapped my face and asked me, "Hey, why are you still not home?" I was dumbfounded. I didn't know the guy. At first I thought that maybe he'd mistaken me for somebody else. I also thought that he was drunk. But then, he started grabbing me to walk with him. I shouted for my friend to help. Fortunately, she was still near. She then grabbed my arm and started to play tug-of-war with this guy. There were a lot of people at that moment. The guy shouted, "Don't bother us, this is my wife." My friend also shouted, "Please help us, this is my classmate." Nobody dared to help. We were making a scene outside school on rush hour, and everybody was just watching. We felt really helpless. I remember seeing a few familiar faces from school, but they didn't move. I guess they were as shocked as I was. I was also paralyzed that time, unable to detach myself from the guy. Another guy came though and shouted, "I'll shoot you." He tried to help the other guy in grabbing me from my friend. But one schoolmate tried to help, but the other guy punched him. After which, the guy punched me, hitting my face. But they also punched my friend, who was brave enough to not let go of me. We obviously kept shouting for help, and a nearby street vendor came to help and shouted, "She's a student, we should help." As she came near us, the other guy punched her also. The street vendor eventually came with a dog, and after the guy punched her dog bit the guy. The dog also proceeded to bite the guy who was hugging me the entire time, and then they both ran away while the dog chased them away. The experience was really traumatic. I had to change my daily outfits for months after that so the two guys wouldn't recognize me if we ever met somewhere. I am a dog lover though, and having been saved by a dog was really heartwarming. For a while when I was still in college, I would still see the street vendor and the dog on some occasions. But the two guys, who I can only guess were trying to abduct me, I never did see them again. So starting from the beginning, way back when I was about 6, I'm 18 now, I had just gone through 6 losses when I was 5. All the people that I had lost were very close to me, one of them being my grandmother, paternal. I had to move in with my mother's family. I was always close with my mum, so I was kind of excited to move in. But after I moved in, we all started having these weird experiences. I'm only really able to speak on mine, but here's what happened. I'd be talking to my sister at night and sit up to find out that she was never really there to begin with, or losing something only to find it in a totally separate part of the house. Everything was small at first. When we moved into our own place, it stopped for a while in fact, but when we started visiting the house every weekend, it was like all of the small things just followed us to that apartment. My parents went to rehab to get clean, so we wound up moving into the house again. My Aunt Ruth was in charge. Her and her boyfriend were addicted to Oxy. She was awful as well. She would ground us for 30 days plus at a time and only let us go outside if we did the tasks that she was supposed to be doing to live there rent-free in the first place. She gave a 9-year-old a chainsaw and it was like get to work, unsupervised as well on the back porch. But anyway, weird little things started happening as soon as we moved in there. We would hear things like footsteps in the attic when nobody else was home. The windows don't open, they're little metal openings in the wall, and nothing can hit through the slots or anything. Or there was banging in the garage when everybody was in bed. But things got worse after Chris died. I didn't really ever dislike him, but there's nothing anybody could have done. It was about a month or two after my parents moved into the family home. It's downstairs and next to the dining room. You could see into the middle garage, which was a little room in between the garage and the house. And they always said that they saw a man with long white hair pacing back and forth, talking to himself, but it was always nonsense, and no words with actual meaning, that is. Now, Chris had picked up this habit of laying in bed and talking to who everybody, including me, thought was himself. But one day I was sleeping. It was about 7 p.m, and it was like I'd just woken up and was moving around, but I never actually woke up. And I saw this woman was walking around. She was really beautiful. She wore a black dress that went to her ankles and black high heels, a pearl necklace and big neat curls, and she was sitting on the bed. And I knew she wanted me to talk to her. We got up and we walked until we got to my aunt's bed where Chris was laying, talking gibberish to himself again, and she stood over it and put a hand on my shoulder. And then she said, "He's going to come with us soon." And then I woke up to Ruth arguing with Chris about voices that he'd apparently been hearing, and of course she assumed that it was the drugs. Who wouldn't, right? He was found hanging in the woods behind the family dry cleaners the next day by his dad. And then his dad hung himself in the back patch of the same woods that week. After all that happened, things mostly calmed down. I went to middle school, started 8th grade, and I was struggling with mental health myself and had attempted to take my own life multiple times as well. I was in and out of hospitals and eventually went to a group home where I was transferred to a long-term hospital that sent me home. But when I moved back in, everything was just different. Usually weird things would happen to us in our house, but I would go to my friend's house, and for days after I left, things that usually happened at my house were happening there now, while my house would be fine. The energy here was always heavy as well, and nobody can relax, and my friends refuse to come over because things happen to them and their houses when they leave. The biggest and most terrifying things happened this year, though. The first one was actually a phone call. My stepdad was sitting on the chair in his bedroom. We were smoking, and he got a call and he put it on speaker so that we could still smoke. But nobody spoke. It was just a keyboard smashing. Then a woman repeatedly saying her fingerprints were cold and she couldn't feel her fingers. Also, every single male in my house has been sexually harassed by something. Lately, I feel like I've been targeted. And what made me share this was an experience from last night. So I was in my room in the nude because I just showered. I was doing my hair in my computer chair with a towel down to keep the chair dry. And first, I could have sworn that somebody was behind me. I felt like someone was watching me, like they were staring directly at me, if that makes sense. So I stood up to light an incense and I started to pray. And I swear to you that towel was yanked right from under me. After I got into bed and I shut the lights off, it was about 3:30 in the morning. I was just about to fall asleep when I felt something that was almost like a hand, but was way too big for one, and long. And it wrapped around my knees and pushed me. I started praying while having a mini panic attack, and eventually I just ran downstairs, grabbed a Bible, prayed for like 20 minutes, and then I just slept on the couch. While I've been sharing this with you guys as well, 3 doors downstairs opened and slammed. I'm home alone with my stepdad, and he's in his bedroom. I couldn't include every experience that me and my family have had, obviously, in this house, because that would mean talking for basically forever. But if anybody wants to hear more, or can even give me some tips, I'd be happy to share, and I'm all ears. To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the colleges are mostly open 24/7, so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here, though, is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnight in a gas station, a liquor store, when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online, so they wouldn't ruin my availability for a full-time job. The store that I had worked at only had one person working on overnights for a long time, even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into the liquor store and the gas station in the middle of the night. They basically did nothing about it. The owner's hand was forced, though, on one night before I started working there, that a woman came in to buy some milk, went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and shove a gun to her back, demanding her money. She complied with him, and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store sobbing hysterically, and though the police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred having two people on, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The night seemed to go by just so much quicker when there was somebody else there, and it was really nice that the person that I normally closed with and I got along really well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job, and she really was only working there as a favour to one of the managers, so she only worked 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I 2 nights a week. Dixie was actually really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't particularly like the job and want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with one person more than 1 day a week. Nobody really seemed to like him or like working with him, and Nick was a little off from the start. He was one of those people who told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that nobody was really comfortable hearing. One thing that he always seemed to talk about as well was the strain on his marriage. Apparently, he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time or something, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, I'll admit, but you kind of get used to some people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to sort of escalate just out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so that he wouldn't become violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, right? But okay, I guess. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories. So, as creepy as that was, I assured him that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick to it and are honest with the medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed pleased with this answer, and soon after, the subject was turned to other things. He was also especially cheery and nice to me after that for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and felt like things were going well with him. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone else, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished that he would stop talking to me about it and would just leave me alone. Josh had a wife and a daughter who was 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls through the eyes of what his daughter might potentially have to deal with when she was our age, and seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I'll admit I was grateful for, and he didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick, like, ever. But it wasn't long before Nick started conversations with me going into details about why he was diagnosed, instead of just how his medicine was working, which I won't go into here because a lot of it was very violent and sort of sexual. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he understood and then change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided to Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it and told her friend, which was the manager, who asked her to come to work there. The manager couldn't really seem to do much though, since I was really the only one that he would talk to about these things, and told me to come to her again if he ever made me feel uncomfortable again. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him, especially after he was talked to by the manager. And soon enough, 2 other women who worked with him on the night shift report comments that he made to them to the manager as well. I was questioned, in which I agreed to all of the statements made by the women were similar to things that had been said to me, and Nick was given a final warning and also a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, though, he would go on rants about how people were only reporting him because they didn't like him. I assumed that he didn't know that I'd been questioned, and neither Josh or I had any intention to tell him. But he got so angry at one point that he practically was in tears, saying how lucky these people were that he was on his meds and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that the shift ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat with him. And then he nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had come extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that still needed to be put out on the shelf. But one thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do as well, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking the drink coolers. It was true, I suppose, that it was a lot easier to do at night when there were a lot less customers. So it was annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't remember the time that Josh went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we'd been there for a while at that point. I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full that we didn't have, when the bell chimed, signaling someone had come in. I threw out a good evening, and I'd be right there since anyone that came in that late usually only wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for the gas and cash. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically when I saw who it was. And you guessed it, there was Nick, looking at me but leaning next to my register. Now, I'd be lying if I said that I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out that he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of booze that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right on the other side of the wall as well. Even so, though, I considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go or if I should run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old girl, let me tell you. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned toward me, and that's when I noticed immediately that there was just something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted, and he just stared at me, nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring, and he said, "You leave here alone?" It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steadfast voice that Josh was in the cooler and asked if he wanted me to go and get him. Again, though, he just stared at me in silence. I didn't really care what he said anymore. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was really creeping me out. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" And as soon as I stopped speaking, he grinned at me, and in a disgusting, almost singing voice he said, "You're lying. You're alone." He laughed and took a step toward me, but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point, I definitely should have run to Josh. I should have called for him, anything, but I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I never felt in actual danger around him before. He had never come off as just more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in this slow stumbling step motion though, telling me to come here, I just want to talk. I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was particularly amusing and laughed loudly enough that Josh told me later that was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks and see what was going on. Josh was out of the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything, just sort of stared each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now, man." Nick stared blankly for a moment, then scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't have been there, and he had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corralling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both of our parts, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or just really undercoordinated, he missed Josh's face completely, and Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down as he smashed his knees into Nick's stomach or chest area, I'm not sure which, and used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the cops as we heard this sickening crack behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie of one or an actual car wreck when someone hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through and it turns white all around the point of impact, that is what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do this time. I ran to the register and I grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door and huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that he turned to see the glass, and that was the first time that he had noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a bit of a mystery and maybe even a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so hard, but between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation pretty quickly. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address because just as I got up to look at a receipt to see what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back on the floor and she told me that the officers were already on the way and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at a part of the window that he'd been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it break through, though. From that hole, though, he could reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole that he had just formed, and said in that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time, "They're never going to find you two." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was panicking as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole of a man and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backward from the impact. Josh yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us. The door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain as he realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he'd actually planned this out, and it seemed like he had actually planned to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me time to slam the back room door shut and lock it, though. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything that he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick reached it. He must have heard me crying because he kept calling out my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted. He would make sure that I died before I ever felt the pain if I opened the door. He then started stabbing the door, screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed it at first, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had actually dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go and get it. So we had no idea how long until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last too long against his body slams, and offered very little protection if his knife went into one of our hands. And all I could think about was, this might be the moment that I die. That my dog would never know why I didn't come home. That I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life. That all the other plans for the future my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. And then, in the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly just went silent. There was no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. And we both slammed to the ground when a gunshot went off once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence, then a voice rang out asking if anyone was there. We weren't sure if we should say anything. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things aside in front of the door, opening it just enough to put his head out of it, and then it just seemed like all the breath just left him. He opened the door and went out into the store, relief all over him. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer were, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but they all were pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. Nick was actually found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he'd been using to do his drinking and do drugs in so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently the reason that he'd come after us was because he thought that the reason that Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening texts and phone calls that she'd been getting. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him too. He said that I wasn't actually the target, and he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. And the reason that I'm sharing this story now is that, other than other stories here inspiring me, is that I got a call 2 weeks ago notifying me that as long as there's no setbacks to his health status, Nick is set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he actually said that he'd received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, obviously, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I've switched to going to college completely online, and am in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. And I don't think that he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what had happened. And I've listened to so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone seems to be so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person that they're writing about again. I don't think I'd be any more prepared to face him this time, though, than I was back then, if I'm being honest. I've also had pretty intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence, louder and clearer than I've ever heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you two. So, firstly, I'm actually French, and this story happened in France a few months ago. So, please excuse my English if it isn't perfect. So I was driving late at night with a friend, his name was Bob, on a little road in the middle of nowhere. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning, I think. We were surrounded by woods and fields, typical landscape when you're in the country here. After a tiny corner in the middle of a forest, we saw a lady on the side of the road a few dozen meters in front of us. Immediately, my friend, who was the driver, slowed down the car to see if she needed help. She looked like a normal lady, not a ghost or a white lady or anything. Plus, my friend isn't very superstitious, so he thought that she was lost or maybe something more serious. Personally, as we were approaching this person, I started to feel uncomfortable, I'll admit, because I just knew that something was wrong. I told my friend this, which they say, "Nah, don't worry, I'll just ask her if everything is okay." When we stopped the car, she looked at us and said that her car had a dead battery, and she needs some help. She was in her 40s, maybe 50s, I think, with long grey hair which looked really dirty. At this point, I was wondering how the situation was even possible. We were talking with a totally random woman in the middle of the night, in the middle of a forest. In hindsight, it seems completely weird and very dangerous, but at that moment, my friend was totally fine with the situation. It was a mix of sort of unconscious kindness, I think, or something. But as I was thinking about the situation, she continued speaking and said that her car was on a forest road just at the right of the main road. She showed us a tiny muddy path which was going deep into the woods. I looked at my friend, he looked at me, raised his shoulders and said, "Okay, you can walk in front of the car and we'll follow you." She smiled at this and said, "Oh, thank you so much. You're really nice. I wasn't expecting people like you." She started to walk and we follow her slowly. 10 meters, 50, 100. As we're going deeper into the woods, we started to become more nervous. We weren't able to see the road behind us. My friend started to realize that this was probably a mistake. During this whole thing, I was trying to explain to him how creepy this situation actually was. Finally, though, we arrived at the entrance of a clearing, and that's when things became real. Firstly, there was no car, but just an abandoned house with the roof completely destroyed and 2 caravans. It looked like the camp of some marginals or something. And secondly, the woman started to run to the caravans and disappeared behind them. At this point, it was very clear that this was some kind of an ambush or foul play. My friend immediately went back into reverse, and as we were leaving as fast as the road was permitting it, the girl reappeared and ran to our car. As she wasn't saying anything, just running, Bob accelerated in reverse, and we managed to get back out onto the main road and leave very quickly. But the icing on the cake was when we went immediately to the police station, a few dozen kilometers away. We told them our story, and they said to us that apparently we weren't the first. It appeared as though a couple of marginals and mentally unstable people who were living there were trying to lure drivers away by asking for help. All of the people in the area knew them, so they were aware of them, and it was a very remote road, which meant that there wasn't a lot of strangers passing here. Anyway, thanks for listening, and please, be cautious out there because you never know who you might run into. My dad grew up on a forestry in Queensland, Australia as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life, we've spent a lot of time out in that forest camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. But one place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abusive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him just disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time that we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always sort of the same. That straight-up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, Fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem to be too concerned. But one trip, when I was a teenager, got strange real quick. So my friends and I were all piled into my dad's four-wheel drive, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's, so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill, opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body positioned looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way that you'd be sat if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday, and even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property or anything. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said that he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just sort of drove us through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped-over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise. But instead, he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors, and drove off the farm much faster than he ever drove on those dirt forest roads before. But my friends and I all sort of looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was pretty much futile at best, and dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that, but my friends and I were still very curious about what was going on out there. So, a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took us hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we did find it without Dad's help. Something was off though once we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason though. I must admit that the vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that really didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was really strong, but, I'd spent 2 hours finding this place, and I was going to explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants, with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to each other, but we were definitely on high alert. It honestly felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they had never left in the first place and were just watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from cross-hatched wire sitting over the fire, hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figure that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire or something. But pretty clever, actually. But then, my stomach dropped. As my eyes travelled down from the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another, and then a shirt, then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to get out of there. Some ranger or crazy old bushie hanging out of the trashed hut was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there, and there's no way that anything good had come out of having a child's clothes right by a huge fire and a grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we just picked up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I Never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboy or the kid's clothes. But what I can tell you is that I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's hut without my father ever again. Just after graduation, my family moved into a house previously owned by my great-grandmother. There were 5 of us at first, my parents and I, my friend Kay, and my boyfriend, now husband, who had moved in due to not wanting to move out of state with his family. The house had a sort of odd layout to it, as it had been a mobile home that had an attic in front of it, sort of a living room and the back master bedroom as well. My boyfriend had a room on one end of the house, Kay and I shared a room on the other end, and the kitchen was in the middle. And to get to the main bathroom, you would have to go through the room that Kay and I shared. So, it started with little things, weird feelings, moving objects, the sound of furniture being dragged and moved. Most notably, too, the bathroom door. We started keeping it shut at night, otherwise it would open and close on its own. It did this all the time as well, day or night. We checked for drafts and anything that could have caused it, but in the end we never found anything. We began to notice too that any time it started to move, if we got irritated and told it to stop, the door would immediately cease to move. But one night, we hadn't been in bed long, when Kay got up to use the bathroom. I heard her leave the bathroom without closing the door, and I told her to close it because it bothered me. And I heard the long creak of the door as it slowly shut, but didn't quite click into place. I irritably told her to shut it all the way, but when she responds, "That wasn't me," in a horrified tone from the opposite corner of the room. At that, I turned the light on and the door was completely shut, just not clicked into the frame. I ripped the door open and there was nothing there. We were obviously completely freaked out. I slammed the door and then I told her that this is why I kept the door shut. There was also the knocking, as I like to call it. We had 3 doors on the house leading outside, and pretty frequently we would hear 3 knocks on any of the said doors. I always look at the window before opening the door if we're not expecting any guests, because you never know who might be there. So I would check the window and there was nobody there. I was once standing in front of the back door when this happened as well, and I could clearly see through it, through the window on the door that is, that there was nobody there, but the door was shaking, it was hit that hard. It wasn't long after this, too, that my boyfriend started having vivid nightmares of something trying to drag him from his bed. Later, my mother's friend was over with her toddler, and he was exploring like a normal kid his age does, and he stopped in the doorway to my boyfriend's room and stared for a while. He then came back and started saying "ghost" and pointing at my boyfriend's room. Nobody had mentioned anything remotely related to ghost or scary, and this was just nowhere near Halloween either, so we have no idea where this came from. We tried to brush it off though. I mean, it's just a kid saying silly things, right? But he was insistent. We tried to ask for details, but he would only say "go see" and "ghost." I pointed him back to his room, and he pointed at the small game closet and insisted "ghost, go see." I opened the door for him, and there was nothing there, but he insisted that there was a ghost. The worst night we spent in the house by far, though, was when we'd been in bed for about 45 minutes, when suddenly something slammed into the bed with enough force to shake the whole mattress. My bed frame didn't actually fit in the small room, so the mattress was on a sort of box spring on the floor. But both Kay and I definitely felt it. We turned the light on, and again, there was nothing there, so we got as far from the edges of the bed as possible, and we just tried to sleep. But something grabbed Kay's foot and yanked her blanket away. Once again, the light revealed nothing, and we were terrified. And then something slammed into the wall next to the other side of the bed. These things continued into the night as well, and we ended up just sleeping in the living room with my dad staying with us. My parents eventually moved out after a few months into the house that they were working on and left us in this house. So Kay and I moved into the master bedroom and made our old room the area where we kept our 2 new puppies' kennels. On 3 occasions, my 8-month-old Pit would walk into that room, throw himself on the floor with all of his hair standing on end, and scream and growl while fixated on the upper corner of the room. When he would do this, I would have to physically drag him from the room and shut the door to calm him down. The other dog, too, would somehow get out of a locked kennel when he was left in there alone, and the kennel would still be locked and secure. We still have no idea how he did it. Kay and my mother started hearing voices, too, when they were there alone, and the uncomfortable feeling just got way worse. One night, something actually started clawing at our bedroom door, and we were so freaked out by it that I called my boyfriend to come look at the door from the other side because I was too scared to unlock and open it. The house actually got 5 feet of water in it during Hurricane Harvey, and we tore it down and we eventually moved. I never felt really upset over losing that house, though. I was kind of relieved to be rid of it, if I'm being honest, and really hoped that the flood took whatever was in. So, today has been a particularly slow day at work, and I've been wasting some time reading some stories, and I thought to myself that maybe enough time has passed and I can now share mine. So I had this friend who was really into the occult. Unfortunately, I was the one who got him turned on to it in the first place. But we had a sort of mutual appreciation of the paranormal and all things weird, so I thought the subject would interest him. But he started going deep into the subject to the point where he wouldn't talk about anything else. He would actually interrupt a conversation and force the subject back to the occult matters. Rude, I know, but sometimes people go through phases where their interest is all they want to talk about, right? It was mostly a forgivable offense. I think I should mention too that this particular friend didn't have a very large friend circle. His depression and introverted nature kept him inside a lot. He didn't have the best of luck in relationships with women. His world was kind of small, I suppose, and I did enjoy hanging out with him, so I did my best to be a good friend. I didn't want to brush him off because he was acting a little weirder than normal or anything. And honestly, for the longest time, he was totally a normal guy. We'd chat and play games together on the PlayStation. Sometimes we'd go and see a movie, with my boyfriend accompanying us. We all hung out at the park and we went swimming. Overall, we really had a great time hanging out. But things started to go downhill when he started to smoke DMT. Personally, I think psychedelics are amazing tools that can offer insight into your life, but they should be treated with care and respect. My friend got to the point where he was making it himself, apparently a pretty easy thing to do after a meager amount of research, and he was smoking it daily, multiple times a day. For those of you who aren't familiar with the substance though, when you smoke it, you apparently get transported to a different world, an entirely new plane of existence in fact. Your body and yourself don't exist anymore, you're just exploring this alternate reality dreamscape. People see all kinds of different things there as well. And I guess you can imagine what that may do to a person when they're smoking it like 30 times a day. He started telling me things too, like he was the reincarnated Osiris. He said that he was seeing Egyptian hieroglyphs all over the place in Walking Life. Apparently he had 4 long conversations with entities in his bedroom, even when he wasn't smoking. Of course, I was very alarmed to hear all of this, and I told him that he needed to take a serious break, like nothing at all for a few months so he can find solid footing in reality again. At this point, I was still hanging out with him too because he obviously needed some help, and like I said before, he didn't have a lot of friends that could give him that. He was also the black sheep of the family, so I knew that he wasn't going to get any kind of support from them. He was really close to his sister though, and I did reach out to her on Facebook to express my concerns. I pushed her to talk to him into getting some psychiatric help, because he was slipping past the point of no return. I'm not really sure if she took my message seriously, since we didn't really know each other. Plus, she was at least 6 years younger than us, and possibly didn't grasp just how serious the situation was becoming. In any case, though, I'll jump forward now to the part where things get really creepy. So my boyfriend had made arrangements to hang out with our friend at the park. I didn't really want to go because I felt like I needed a break from him and his nonsensical ranting. I just couldn't deal with it on that particular day. My boyfriend, though, said that he wasn't all that bad, and we went anyway. We get to the park and, yep, he's his usual self, ranting about Egypt and made-up gods that only he knew the truth about, etc. But he also had this large hunting knife that he kept fiddling with the whole time that we were on the walk. He told us that he had been using it in ceremonial magic, and that it helped to banish negative thoughts. It made me extremely uneasy, though, seeing him do that. He would do this thing, too, where he would take the knife and make stabbing motions near his heart or his head, like he was mock-stabbing himself, all the while holding a conversation with me or my boyfriend. I think we were both really on edge and didn't know what to say or do about it. I tried to distract him from doing it by bringing up other subjects that might interest him, but he kept on with his ritual. Keep in mind, we were walking on a trail, so it wasn't like we could just say goodbye then and there and leave. We had to walk back to our car and drop him off at his car. My boyfriend had the bright idea that we should get some lunch after our walk, even though I was doing my best to give him a look that said, "No, you're crazy. Why do you think I want to spend any more time with this guy?" But it must have not have been very effective, or my boyfriend was just ignoring it. Either way, though, we ended up getting in the car to go and get some lunch. Now, in the car I was driving, my boyfriend was in the passenger seat and our weirdo friend was in the back. As we're heading through a busy part of town where all the shopping and the restaurants are, I hear the distinctive sound of a belt buckle coming undone. And then I hear the worst sound imaginable. I peek back out the corner of my eye, and my suspicions were confirmed. This crazy dude was full-on jacking off in our back seat. I mean, pants all the way down, bare butt on the seat, beating it so hard that it was like he wanted to rip it off. Instantly, I felt sick to my stomach, and all the nervous energy I had throughout the day popped up into my head. I was trying not to shake and trying to ignore it, and drive through heavy traffic at the same time. I kind of had a freeze response, I guess, but the whole time I kept thinking about the huge knife that he had in his pocket, and obviously he was completely off his rocker. Quite honestly, too, I was afraid to say anything or confront him because I didn't know how he was going to react. This part is nuts, though, but my boyfriend didn't seem to even notice it, and the whole time he just kept rambling about God knows what. I couldn't listen because my thoughts were 100% focused on driving and trying to act like I didn't know what was going on in my back seat. We get to the restaurant, though, and my boyfriend runs inside to grab some food, which means that I'm left alone in the car with our friend. And I try to act like I'm browsing on my phone when really I'm watching and listening as hard as I can. And we don't talk. My boyfriend finally gets back and I complain that I'm tired, it's been a long day, let's drop him off, etc. So I drive us back to our friend's car and he doesn't get out of our vehicle. He just sits there. I have to get a little bit rude and ask him please to get out and go home. He gets out of our car and walks over to his passenger side. I start getting really scared and I suspected the worst. He pulled a gun out of some kind of a bag that he had on the seat and he just walks over to our car with it. And I still don't know why I did this, but I was really angry, so I just got out of my car and walked right up to him. I was maybe 3 feet away and could see that it was a loaded 9mm. I kept asking him over and over, "What are you doing?" Because apparently that's all my brain could think to do. I told him to get into his car and just go home. He never said anything during this whole time, though, just kind of cried and had this wild look in his eye. For whatever reason, though, he eventually got into his car and he just drove off. I told my boyfriend, obviously, that we were never hanging out with this guy again and that I didn't even want him to talk to him anymore. No contact, nothing. A few months pass and he occasionally messages me through the PlayStation or texts on my phone. He says a lot of random stuff and I just ignore it. It turns out, too, that he'd moved down to near Nashville. I don't know why. He had a roommate, and I think their girlfriend lived there or something. I'm not really sure about the situation at all. I think, though, that maybe he's turning his life around and getting a fresh start down there. Who knows? I still think that it's best to just cut all contact and let him regroup. I'm not interested in any kind of friendship with him anymore, and I know that he needed help beyond what anything I could offer. Again, I reached out to his sister, though, and let her know that he actually had a gun. She managed to get it from him somehow, but it did little good in the end. So I get a call around 11 p.m. one night that wakes me up. It's a man claiming that he's a detective in Gallatin, Tennessee, and my heart skips a beat. I start sweating and immediately ask what happened. And apparently, my former friend stabbed someone to death on Halloween Day. I don't really know all the details, and the articles about it are kind of sparse, but the whole thing is just really surreal for me, and I guess that I'm just feeling that I'm lucky. I'm lucky that I didn't get shot that last summer. In autumn of 2018, I actually broke my left foot, and it required surgery. I lived in a not-so-nice neighborhood in southwest Detroit. Because of the surgery, I had been staying with family while I recuperated, but after the first few days, I drove home to gather some clothes and planned on staying there and driving back to my family's house the next day. I crutched into my house as I was simultaneously talking with a friend that called moments before I got into my door. I really needed to pee, and with the phone nestled between my ear and shoulder, I sort of crutched through my bungalow to the rear of the house. With me talking and the noise of the crutches, I thought that I was hearing noises from my attic, but it wasn't until I got into my bathroom and stopped that I was sure that someone or something was upstairs. I said to my friend something along the lines of, Hey, hang on a second. There's something upstairs here." The initial split-second thought was that an animal was in the house. And no sooner I said that, the loudest boom came down the floor in what seemed like directly over me, and it sounded like the weight of a full-grown man falling. Side details of the attic as well. It was like an attic that could have been converted into a bedroom that went the full length of the house, and I'm 6 feet tall and I could stand right up in the middle of it. But my friend was immediately surprised, responding like, "What was that?" She actually thought that I had fallen, and I was like, "No, someone broke in, they're upstairs." I book out, on crutches no less, back to the front of the door, and I'm waiting for someone to come busting out of my house, somewhere. I put the phone back to my ear and tell my friend that I'll have to call back so I could call a friend who lives nearby. There's no answer. It's not even 60 seconds after my exit. And as luck would have it, a police cruiser turns out of the alley onto my block. I see them and they me, so I wait for them to stop, and they do. They weren't the typical police, though. Like I said, it's not the greatest area. It was an unmarked police car with plainclothes officers, a gang unit car or something, and here in D they're called the Jump Out Boys. I explain what just happened, how I just came home and that I think someone is in my house. This is now all maybe 3 or 4 minutes from the time that I arrived. So, 4 policemen, weapons drawn, embark through my house, and I crutched in tow. They get to the stairs, call out Detroit police several times, and then they head up. I wait at the bottom, and in 1 minute or so, they make their descent and tell me nothing. Nobody's there, and as quickly as they entered, they made their exit. I thank them, and they just drive away. Now, at most, about 8 minutes have lapsed, and there I am, just looking like, what happened? Standing very close to my door in my front room, trying to digest everything and wondering what I had heard. Maybe 20 seconds go by, and I'm just kind of standing there silently with my ear turned up to the roof of my house when I hear what starts almost as a dragging sound, starting at the rear of my house, growing louder as it gets closer to the front. No sooner as it's right above me, the loudest crash as if it was trying to come right through the floor that separated me from it. And I noped right out of there and left back to my family's place, quick smart. About 5 days later, I returned and was really anxious about being there, but nothing ever happened, and slowly, living there just went back to normal. In the end, I really don't know what happened that day. If there was someone living in my roof, or someone broke in, or if perhaps something paranormal was going on. You know, the woods are safe, it's just the people you have to worry about. The one instance that I'll never forget was when a man just showed up at our campground site, also miles from any actual campground, and watched us behind different trees from a distance. A few of us said hello, but he wouldn't answer. Yet, when he saw the kids, he tried to talk to them repeatedly. We were a big group of adults, but since we had children with us, some of the guys finally went over and confronted him. He claimed not to be watching us, and he just walked away. Then, later that night, he pulled up in a beat-up RV and parked right next to our makeshift group site, blocking us in. The RV itself was bizarre and really creepy. He had children's underwear on the dash, toys and junk piled up. It was getting dark and we were all around the fire when he suddenly just walks up and stands in our little circle. He made a comment right off the bat that all the little ones went to bed already, which obviously freaked me out immediately. The guys asked him to leave, semi-nicely, not knowing what his deal was. About a half an hour later, I could see him standing off behind a tree, smoking. I couldn't really see him, but I saw the end of his cigarette, so I guessed it was him. But he just watched and chain-smoked. It was a really unnerving experience. In the middle of nowhere, being watched by a man who seemed to focus on our kids. Not to mention that, out of the 3 other families that we were with, my family of 4 was the only one with a tent, which didn't feel as safe as an RV or camper with him there. I went to bed when our 2 kids did, so that they weren't alone. Our tent was on the further side of the site, away from the fire. Shortly after the kids fell asleep, I heard the crunching in the woods around the tent and called my husband's name, thinking that he was stumbling in the dark looking for our tent door. When he didn't answer, I unzipped the door and shined the light around, right across the feet of the creepy guy. I instantly jumped up and started yelling. All the guys came running from the fire immediately, but the creepy guy just stood there and stared at us. Didn't explain himself, didn't say anything, not that he would have had a good reason anyway, then turned and just walked away. At this point, I was beyond done. We packed up our stuff and we crammed it in the car, pleading with our friends to leave, but they wouldn't. I was the only adult there that hadn't been drinking. No one could drive home. I drove home with my significant other awake and on high alert all the way. Our friends that stayed did have guns, and they all had secure campers and RVs to sleep in. They came home the next night and had even more bizarre encounters with this creep. Each of us did contact the authorities, by the way. But that right there is why I no longer go camping in remote places anymore. So this was about 5 months ago. I don't remember it with complete clarity, I'll admit, and I'm definitely not the best at storytelling events from my life, so bear with me, I'll do my best. So this was about 2 a.m. in downtown Denver. A friend of ours hosts a D&D session every Sunday. Me and my partner normally stay the night, but we had plans the next Monday and had to go early. So we say our goodbyes to everyone, grab our bags, and we head out. It wasn't a long walk at all to the car, not even a block away. Me and my significant other started walking and chatting about the session. Then we both get silent at the same time. Someone was behind us. I don't know how, but we both knew that he was going to be bad news. He continued to follow us to the parking garage, and right before we entered, he spoke up with "Are you ladies 18 or older?" Now, I'm a bit of a bigger girl, 5'10", and more than knew how to hold my own against creeps. But this guy struck me as different. He was a good foot taller than me, a blonde hair, blue-eyed male with one heck of a disgusting smile. Me being the dumb, polite person that I am, I said something like, yes, why? And he proceeded to start saying things like, do you pay your taxes? With a quick response of, sorry, we aren't really at that stage of our lives yet. He quickly responds with a long rant about how taxes are terrible, you should never pay them, they're using your taxes to kill people all the time. The government is killing people, everyone's killing people, and they get away with it so easily. Then he began to move closer and closer to us. My partner is backing up into the garage, and me, being stupid, is too scared to move, just trying to keep him focused on myself rather than her. He gets within a few inches of my face. I try to casually backstep, sort of, keep my movements looking natural, straighten my back out, compensating for the fact that this person is larger than me. His breath, though, was horrible, and you could smell the alcohol with every single word that came out of his mouth, and his blue wristband was still on. Don't know if that's a bar thing or not. All I know is that he had one. He continues on with his rant, though, so my significant other tries to argue back a bit. He starts to move away from me towards her. After a few glances between me and her, we catch on to we need to just do whatever this guy says. When she stops arguing, his rant goes from taxes to political figures and genocide for some reason. And he says, you know, I could kill anyone that I want and get away with it. Anyone can. The government's watching us, but they don't care. Plus, they'll never know. His words were not making much sense. And then he says, you know, we're killing this planet, and it could be solved if we had less of this population here. Mind you, this guy is now back in my face, staying as close as possible. If either of us went for our phone or our watches or whatever, he'd shift to them, and not to compliment him by any means, but he was very perceptive for someone that I assume was drunk out of their mind. The conversation continues for about maybe 5-10 minutes. Felt like an hour, though. I feel pretty disgusted with myself for it, but I'm agreeing with everything that he's saying. At the point, he seemed to be completely forgetful about my significant other. I introduce myself using my character name, and I shake his hand, which allowed me to see a bunch of track marks on his arm. I'm freaking out a bit on the inside, thinking that I'm going to get stabbed or something. I've never even been in a fight, so how the heck do I handle this? All the while smiling and agreeing. And then his behavior shifted. Still staying way too close to me, he starts scratching himself all over, reaching into his left pocket over and over every time that he says kill, or even references it. Honestly, at this point, I was more angry than scared, and started trying to work around him as stepping back was just leading me to a wall. It wasn't working though, no matter how I tried to walk or where I tried to go. He was always right there in my face talking about killing anyone that he wanted, that it would solve the world's problems if people just went out and killed hundreds of others. In the end, I just got really fed up with it, stepped to my right and then quickly to his left and backed up straight out of the garage. He followed, so did my partner behind him. But we were finally out in the open again. I sent so many desperate looks to people walking by as he kept getting more and more pushy and ever closer to me, so much so that he was almost chest to chest with me. I don't know what came over me in the end, but I grabbed my significant other's arm. I mustered the best smile that I could, and I said, I just want to hold your hand. As a gay person with a few homophobic and crazy people encounters, this was definitely my worst idea ever. She handed me her hand, I pulled her by me, and this man that seemed like a huge threat backed up immediately, saying, "Oh, you two are together. Oh, yeah, no, I'm cool with that. Have a great night." It's kind of humorous, but also a bit weird that this is the one time that my sexuality has ever saved me rather than put me in danger. We waited until he was far up the street, and then we went straight to the car. And the second that we got in, we locked the doors and drove off. I was shaking the whole car ride home. We actually passed him later down the road as well, and me and him made direct eye contact one last time. So my friend and I were both federal law enforcement at the time of this story. We were working out of southeastern Arizona at the time, and we both enjoyed the outdoors. He has done mountain climbing and camping around the world and stuff like that. I've camped and hiked around the US and had some experience hunting in Florida, and was comfortable with being in the remote wilderness, often alone even. Chiricahua isn't very remote in my experience, hardly the most out of where I've been. But we went there to the National Monument area last winter for an easy hike to take in the scenery. Apparently the hanging rocks and the vistas were pretty nice. Spoiler, they were. It's worth noting too that I've only recently learned of the missing 411 cases and wasn't aware of it at the time. So we arrived and had both brought our service handguns, which we habitually did off duty. We then hiked about an hour down the trail away from one of the parking lots. There were many rocks as well as some small outcroppings, grottos and caves. It was partly cloudy when we arrived, but clear enough for the sun to shine through. We made it an hour down a looping trail that took about 2.5 hours round trip estimate. At this point, it had become full-on overcast with moderate fog and very light rainfall. I remember it being particularly gloomy at this point. Still, though, we were enjoying the hike, although the temperature dropped considerably. Shortly after the fog came in, the last part of the bad weather change, we heard a strange set of 3 knocking noises from behind a hanging rock at the top of the gorge that we were in at that point. It sounded vaguely like a heavy tool being slammed against the rock, in the cadence of maybe 2 knocks a quarter of a second apart, a short second delay, then a third knock. These 3 knock sequences repeated several times from that location. We stopped as soon as we heard it, and we were immediately made uneasy for some reason. After several sets of knocks, it stopped, and we started moving about 50 yards when we heard the same several set of knocks from the opposite side of the gorge. Then, again from a third position that was once again above us on the rim of the gorge, near some large monolithic rocks. We then had a very uneasy and frightening feeling. My friend told me something to the effect of, "Hurry up, let's get out of here. I don't like this." And we started moving out of there at a constant jog. For the next 5 minutes, we heard a few more sets of knocks from the 3 different locations, and I felt very much in danger for my life for some reason. At one point, we even stopped at the outcropping on the rim of the gorge. We both had our hands on our holsters and did a quick look at the ridge above us. We instinctively grabbed cover before doing so, and I guess that just shows just how disturbed we were. When we made it to the trail crossroads at the end of the loop near the visitor center, we had lost the feeling of dread about a half-mile back, I'd say. We went to the visitor center and asked the ranger there if there were any crews working in the area or any groups of people doing something that sounded like the knocking that we described. She said that it sounded like we heard woodpeckers. I played my roommate a clip of the woodpecker native in the area via YouTube on my phone, and the sound was vaguely similar, but the tapping of the woodpecker was much faster, and it wasn't quite as deep-toned. He said, "Oh, that does kind of sound like it. We probably just heard that and got freaked out." I didn't agree, but I felt as if it would be embarrassing to admit that I still felt something very weird actually happened, so I feigned agreement. And then we just drove off. Now, like I said, I learned of missing 411 many months later on a weird part of YouTube, sort of a binge late one night. But when I saw Pilates was former LEO, I took it much more seriously and fell down the rabbit hole. I actually mostly forgot about the incident at this point, and I didn't actually connect the dots until I saw that the mountains that we were at were supposedly a hotspot of disappearances when looking for any clusters around Arizona. I then told my friend about this when he was over my apartment one day. At first it was about the 411 in general, and he seemed interested. I then told him the really creepy part is that the mountains that we were at is supposedly a cluster. And his eyes went wide, and he looked really spooked. He replied with, really? Upset and sort of incredulous. I replied with, yeah, I still don't think that these were woodpeckers, man. And he said, I didn't want to say it, but I don't actually think so either. Whatever was going on, it almost felt supernatural. This is how I honestly felt inside at the time as well, in retrospect, but I just didn't want to say it. What do you guys think? Does this sound 411 related? Is the place that we were at a cluster? I would love to hear your thoughts. About 2 years ago, I personally believed that something entered my house. So I was in my room and a family friend was coming over to grab something. I unlocked the door so they wouldn't have to knock or anything. They actually live really close by, so about 5 minutes later, I hear the door open, and my dog started barking and bolts downstairs as per usual. But then I heard the creaking of someone walking up the stairs and into the living room. As they walked up the stairs, I clearly heard in their voice them shout, hello, so I shouted hi back and said that I'd be down in a few minutes. But then, about 2 minutes later, I'd say, I hear the doorbell ring, and my dog starts barking and running downstairs again. So I go down confused. When I get to the door, I saw said family friend outside it, and the door was now locked. I unlocked and opened the door and asked, "Oh, did you forget something?" And he just looked at me confused. He then said, "I just got here, dude." Confused now, I peeked into the living room and saw that nobody was there. I was still confused, but brushed it off and just continued on with the day. Although, the more that I thought about it, the more unsettling it seemed. I mean, think about it. Someone or something opened the door, locked it, mimicked the person's voice perfectly, then walked upstairs and just disappeared. And I know that I didn't just hear something, as my dog reacted to it too, and the doors can't just lock themselves like that. And no, the family friend doesn't have a key. I tend to tell this story to people who will actually listen. Some think that I just heard something or imagined it. Others truly believe me. But honestly, I really don't know what happened that day. It's not a truly terrifying experience, I suppose, but it's been really unnerving me. And I hope that whatever came here that day doesn't come back, if it's not here already. So this happened a few years ago when my daughter was around 4 or 5 years old. My daughter started talking about her friend Emily, and I just put it down to her imagination, as she's creative and always has been. Emily was mentioned a lot, in fact, and then one day I was home alone just having coffee and watching TV when I heard my daughter's toys going off. They were all the sort that had to be pressed or pushed to make noise. She's monkey obsessed and had a big pink monkey that made monkey noises when the middle is pressed, but it's difficult to press it right, if that makes sense. This monkey was one of the toys that went off, so I got up and walked to her room, and a couple of her other noisy toys were going off and flashing. The light on her small fish tank was on, even though I knew that I'd turned it off. I lived in the UK at the time and was on top-up electric and gas. I'll admit too that I was a bit freaked out, but not majorly, due to our old house having some serious haunting going on that was much more malicious feeling, and I didn't really feel that uneasy with this. I then noticed that it was time to go and pick up my daughter from school, so I switched the light off and left. On the way home, I thought that I'd talk to her about Emily, and she started telling me a lot of the details, like Emily is 18 and has long brown hair. Her full name is Emily Rose Ward, and she died when she got sick, and she wears a long nightie. Ward is a fairly common surname, but my great-grandma's surname was actually Ward, and she died shortly after my daughter was born. And I knew that she had 2 sisters, one who was named Emily, who died of tuberculosis when she was only 18. I'm now convinced that she was my daughter's friend during this time. I've never really told this story to anyone, as my family are very much, if you can't see it, feel it, or hear it, it doesn't exist. And my husband just mocks me about my belief in the paranormal. But I stumbled across this site some time ago, and I thought that I would share it. Thanks for listening. So this happened back when I was about 17. I can't remember exactly why I was walking down the street, but it was a rather dangerous street in the city, pretty late at night. I walked past a private show girl house where girls were trying to attract customers, and also came across a druggie house to give you an idea of where I was. But along my walk, I passed a dark parking lot and suddenly heard a man say, "Hey," in a hushed tone. Turning around, I searched and found an absolute unit of a man lurking in the shadows, his face hidden. Yes," I answered timidly. He proceeded to try and flirt with me, complimenting me a lot and trying to offer me dinner out. Literally no restaurants are open at this time, though. I was very shy and scared back then as well, so I kept politely declining, but he just wouldn't stop badgering me. He was determined to take me somewhere, presumably on a date. But finally, after a few minutes of me just straight declining, he started walking towards me quickly. I braced myself going into a defensive position when he stopped just at the end of the parking lot before the lights. I still couldn't see him well, and then he said in a smooth and calm tone that a pretty girl like me should be careful, because he knew there was a man around here picking up girls in a white truck, raping them, murdering them, and then dumping their bodies. Fully freaked out now, red alarms blaring in my head, I started to walk backwards, away from this creep. That's when I saw what I'll always remember. He walked over to a car in the parking part of the lot that I hadn't noticed, opened the car door, and got into a white truck. I turned and sprinted away, hearing him rev his engine and tear out of the parking lot. Thankfully, I lost him, cutting through other areas and sprinting like a madman. But, man, I'll never forget that absolutely terrifying unit of a man. When I was around 7 years old, my parents rented out our basement to a young couple, a man and a woman. Things went smoothly for the first couple of months for the most part, save for the occasional loud party here or there. They were nice enough, and would even leave their door open, which was under our backyard porch, for my siblings and I, the youngest being 5 and the oldest 9 years old, to wander in and out and use their basketballs, badminton, and all that stuff, whenever they were home. They would let us come and go as we pleased, although we didn't do so very often because my parents weren't very comfortable with the idea, of course. As time went on, they started getting a bit out of hand, throwing loud parties until all hours of the night, and disturbing the neighbours, sketchy people coming in and out, and my parents suspected that they were growing something in the basement, as the house constantly smelled like weed all throughout. My parents did end up finding a plant being grown in the closet under a lamp, and evicted them immediately. Weed wasn't legal at the time. A few years went by until a family member, who works in corrections, came over one day. They began talking to my mum about our former tenants, and asked if we ever knew where they ended up, and she said that she didn't. The family member then told us that a man was brought into the facility that they worked at, who looked and sounded very familiar, but they weren't able to place him. They suspected, though, that the man may be our ex-tenant, who was actually being held on charges of sexual assault and murder, but that they weren't sure if it was him or not. Eventually, though, my mum was able to confirm the identity of the man as being our ex-tenant. He was arrested for raping and murdering his ex-girlfriend with his father. My parents didn't tell us until years later, but it was pretty wild news considering how many times he had invited my siblings and I without hesitation into the basement whenever we were out playing in the yard. I moved to an apartment in an old building, and ever since I did, the very first night, I heard my upstairs neighbours walking around the house during the night. Since I have insomnia, I just stay awake during many nights and would hear them walking. It normally started around 3 in the morning, so I began to notice a bit of a pattern. They would walk from 3 till about 6, and during the winter, when the nights were longer, sometimes I'd hear them dragging some furniture. By the sound, I thought that it was a chair or a small table, from about 7 to 9. I heard them a few times during the evening as well. My friends heard them too, and some even asked me if it didn't bother me to have loud neighbours like that, but I was okay with it. I lived in that apartment for 3 years, and I'd hear them almost every day. I met one of my upstairs neighbours once too, and she came to my apartment to ask me if my hot water was working. She was an older lady and pretty nice, so I would always say hi to her whenever I met her in the elevator or around the building. Now, when I was moving out, I actually decided to say goodbye to that lady, so I went upstairs for the first time. I noticed that the apartment above mine had a sign saying that it was closed due to a police investigation, and the door was locked. I got worried about the lady, so I rang the door of the apartment across the hall, and to my surprise, the lady answered the door. She invited me in to drink a tea with her, and I accepted, and we started chatting and got to the subject of that apartment. When I asked her about it, she said that it was a terrible story, that the guy that lived there had killed his wife and baby, and tried to end himself too 5 years ago, and the apartment had been locked ever since. I asked her if the police were still coming to the apartment to investigate, and she said no, that it had been closed for at least 4 years now. I tried to come up with a lot of explanations about the noises, and my curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to fly my drone outside their window next time that I heard something, and to my surprise, the apartment was completely empty. I could still hear those steps loud and clear. I can't explain the noises, but I'm sure that there was something there. And boy, am I happy that I've moved out of that building. This story happened to me about 12 years ago. I was around 24 at the time, and I worked hospitality, so it'd be later at night when my friends and I would hang out. At around 9 o'clock, my friend and I decided to go for a drive, someplace we'd never been, just to sort of get in the car and go sort of thing. I offered and wanted to drive because my mother was out of town and I was using her Mercedes. It was one of those early 90s E-bodies, the ones that were big piles of heavy steel, a real tank of a car. I only mention the car body because it becomes pretty relevant in the story. He happily agreed though, and so we hit the road. Now, we lived near Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. Good old Wisconsin, where you get a lot of really good stories out of, I've noticed. It seems to be a pretty paranormal state, but either way, we drove north out of the city and drove for about an hour when I see an exit that I don't recognize and decided to get off there. There was really nothing at this exit, other than cornfields. No gas station or restaurant signs, no visible light of a town in any direction, so we were in a place that we didn't recognize. But that was the point. Just driving to get nowhere because the speed limit was 35 and we were in no rush. The moon was out enough that everything was pretty visible. About a mile into the cornfields, we could see 2 kids on the right side of the road. We comment on just how weird that was because there was no housing or stores or even lights on the horizon. Plus, it was 10:30 at night. Naturally, too, we were 2 larger guys, so we don't worry too much about anything. I slowed down so we can inquire if their car had broken down or if they were okay. As we pulled up, I noticed the kid in front's clothing. It was a stained cream-coloured tweed-type shirt with real tattered sleeves and overalls with only one strap. He appeared to be maybe 12 years old. The second kid was taller, wearing a red flannel-type shirt, with old-time-looking khaki pants. However, I could barely notice the taller kid standing further behind the smaller one because, as I pulled up noticing the clothes, I got to see the whole child fully, and his arms were to his side, slightly raised, almost in that sort of iconic zombie way. But his eyes is what really stopped me. I couldn't take my eyes off of his, and I did my best to mutter to my friend, "You're seeing this too, right?" Because his eyes were pitch black, blacker than the night in fact, but easy to see as he just sort of stood there staring at us. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I've never been so frightened in my life, and I've had several odd experiences that have left me unable to deny that there is more in this world than what we can understand. So, we're stopped there for a moment, locking eyes with whatever these things are, and I can assure you that it wasn't a normal child. There was something off about them, and I have zero doubts about that. We quickly agree to go, and fast. We decide in the end that we're not going to inquire with them. This was straight out of the Twilight Zone, and I remember the hitchhiker, and that was not happening tonight, no way. So we go and we clamor between ourselves. What the heck just happened? What did we just see, and what was that? Still no signs of homes, mind you, just open cornfields. How these two kids could be there, I have no idea, but I don't believe that those were kids. So I keep driving, and we get out of the fields into a wooded, windy road shortly after probably around 5 minutes. Here in Wisconsin, there are random historical markers displaying in whatever year this happened information sort of thing. I only mention that because I passed one on the curve, so I glanced at that. And as I'm driving through a curve going about 45 miles per hour, what I can only describe as a creature walks in front of my car, my mum's car, and as I saw it, it was nothing like I've ever seen before. Its spine was sort of elongated and tall. It stuck above the hood ornament as I hit it as well. It was grey colour and looked nothing like I'd ever seen. It had a very tall arch in its spine, almost like when a cat hisses and goes on its toes, that kind of shape, but in a very sort of tall, gangly creature. And I hit this thing straight on with the tank that is the Benz. My friend is freaked out at this point, as I am too, to say the least. I stop immediately, but now we're both a bit scared from the children of the corn just walking around out there, and then this thing literally within minutes of one another. So we decided that getting out is not going to happen. But I decided to stay in the locked car, use the car and its lights to see what we hit and make sure whatever the heck it was is dead, and I needed to know what I just saw as well. So I drive in tiny circles, backing up and forwards, looking for this creature, but after checking every inch within 100 yards and not seeing a thing, including not a drop of blood where I hit it, straight on with a Benz, mind you, and making contact with its spine as well, body and head too, there was just nothing. That was unnerving, and although I wanted to check my mother's car, that would be dealt with further down the road for sure. But we were not going to get out here, so we decided to just head home at this point. 15 minutes later, before I got back to the freeway and I needed to get out and see how bad the car was, as I got out to check, quickly too, as I wasn't taking any chances tonight, I noticed that my grill was busted in, but nothing too bad. So I made sure that it was secure and I got back in as quickly as possible. My friend decided to stay in the car, like a big chicken. But recently, I actually heard of the black-eyed kids, and it really freaked me out a bit. I didn't know that they were a real thing, and I definitely didn't know about them at the time. I thought that I just saw a couple of demon kids, or ghosts, or I didn't know what to think at the time. To this day, I've looked through tons of photos of supposed cryptid beasts and mythological creatures, looking for what I hit, and the closest I found is probably something akin to a Wendigo, and they were very close to what I believe I saw and hit that night. It seems very odd, though, that both things could happen so close to one another, or even be related like that. Or perhaps they're not related. I don't know. It was possibly an evil area, or a ley line, or something. I don't know, I'm just guessing. I would like to point out, though, that I've lived in Wisconsin a long time, and it was not a deer or coyote or anything else. But what I hit was nothing native to the known Wisconsin landscape, that much is for sure. And neither were those horrid kids as well. For as long as I live, though, I'll never forget either of those faces, and I just hope that I never come across anything like that again. My friend had gotten a good deal on his first house, something like $100,000, which was really good for a small house. But as soon as he moved in, something was just off. He lived there with his girlfriend too. So the first encounter with the noises was when they were inside the house moving in. My friend was going up to the attic to store some extra stuff that wouldn't fit to pawn off later. As he was going up the ladder to the attic, he heard a scrambling noise. He went up there and just a terrible smell hit him. But it was a 20-year-old house, so he didn't think too much of it. After he went down, though, he heard something again in the attic. He figured it was just a rodent, and after a few weeks called an exterminator. The exterminator went up and found a bunch of cocaine, heroin, every drug you can think of, just sitting there. He called the cops and they arrived to search the house. My friend was cuffed, the house was searched and the attic too, and they found a pipe in the corner leading to a crawl space. They didn't have a crawl space that they knew of. The cops went back downstairs and searched the house. They eventually found nothing, and my friend took it upon himself to break the base underneath the house, and he found a living space with his stuff from the attic in it, and a guy with long brown hair, a torn hoodie, and my friend's extra shoes. He yelled for the cops, still out front, and got the F out of there quickly. The cops wanted the man to put his gun down. He did. They told him to get in cuffs. He walked over to the hole my friend had broke and accepted his fate. He was charged with illegal drug trafficking and sentenced to a year in prison. It still creeps me out, though, even though he moved the heck away from there a few months ago, to know that some drug dealer was hiding in his house for months, with a gun too. A few years ago, when I was 16 to 17, I worked in a restaurant as a waitress. There were 2 locations, one in my town, which we'll call Restaurant A, and one in a town about 30 minutes away, Restaurant B. I should mention too that Restaurant B is located in a rougher area, and many of my co-workers weren't from the best of backgrounds. Nonetheless, they were sweet people, and I honestly trusted them. I was trusted as a manager on Thursdays at Restaurant B, which usually meant that I was the cashier, server, manager, and the only other person would be a cook, which I'll call Dave. In the restaurant, there's a front glass door that customers use and a back wood door, no window in the door, that we use to take out the trash and such. One day, we had no business, and I was in the kitchen with Dave and another cook that was about to leave. But we're standing around talking, with Dave right in front of the back door, and the other cook to the side of the door, and me about 5 feet away from Dave in line with the door. He had a bag of trash in his hand, and he was going to take it out. He opened the door while facing me and talking, and behind the door was a person. It was clearly a person in a grey t-shirt, jeans, and a black hat. I saw him for a split second, long enough to know that someone was definitely there, and then Dave saw my face and turned around, which blocked my view, and the guy was gone. The other cook saw my face turn white as a sheet when David opened the door and joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost, and the irony was real. While Dave started looking around outside to see what I could have seen, I started actually panicking. I have severe anxiety and panic disorder, and Dave was trying to calm me down, but he also seemed really freaked out. He asked me what I had saw, and I told him that I saw some person. I described the person, and what he told me next will never leave me. Dave started crying and ran out the door with his phone in his hand. He was outside for nearly half an hour, and when he came back in, he was calmer but still nervous. He told me that roughly 10 years ago, he and his friend were in a horrible car accident which ended with his friend dying. He told me that the person I described standing outside of the door was wearing the exact outfit that his friend had died in, and apparently I wasn't the first person to see the ghost of his friend. Dave told me that whenever something were to happen to anyone in his family, his friend would show up to either him or his family. For example, one time he saw the ghost of his friend, and literally a minute later, his phone rang and he found out that his father had just suffered a massive heart attack. When he had went out of the door, he was calling his family to make sure that everyone was okay. Luckily, they were, but not even 2 days later, he found out that his wife had a miscarriage. And as if that wasn't weird enough, The same night, I saw the ghost again, and something else weird happened that I believe was paranormal, but I also understand could have been just paranoia. So I was up at the front of the register, still shaken up, and a huge crow was hovering outside of the front door. It was weird because it was literally just kind of flying in place. It suddenly flew away, and then a really strange-looking man approached the door, opened it wide, but didn't enter. He had the creepiest smile on his face the entire time, and moments later, the crow was back, and it almost came into the restaurant, but another customer swatted it away. The man literally just turned around, left, didn't order anything, and didn't say a word to anyone. I know it kind of sounds all a bit weird and kind of out there, but I'm just hoping someone reads this and understands that what I went through is real, because everyone I know doesn't believe in the paranormal and thinks that I was just imagining things, but I know that I wasn't. When I was 13, I had this girlfriend who I'd played hockey with for years. She has a little frame, very thin, tomboyish too, always got called a boy because of her style, and I slept over at her house during the summer a few times. But we're both pretty short, and she has brothers, older and younger. I was wearing a pink hoodie and she was wearing a backwards cap. So I'm sleeping over at a house in this fancy suburban neighborhood. Big houses, everyone has a pool, but not fancy enough where you need to get buzzed in or anything. We're outside, it's the morning, and she's teaching me how to skateboard. But we always had this dumb joke where we butt scooted, where we sat on the skateboards and rolled down her road, which was just a big hill. We were doing this when we noticed a car pulling down behind us, so we got up and walked back to a house on the sidewalk. Girlfriend makes a comment about not recognizing the car and whatever. We're messing around in a driveway when we notice the car very slowly pulling up a bit in front of a driveway by the neighbor's house. This means that they must have gone to the bottom of the cul-de-sac, turned around and driven back up. The man in the driver's seat gestures towards us and nods. The woman in the passenger seat gets out of the car and starts walking towards us. I'm from a poorer neighborhood and not easily frightened. I didn't find anything suspicious here in this nice neighborhood, so I started walking toward her and the girlfriend grabs my wrist. "Wait, no. Get in the garage now." What? This lady is just lost or something, I thought. But upon hearing my girlfriend loudly say to get in the garage, the strange lady raps on her window and yells something at the man. Girlfriend and I run into the garage. The lady rushes up the driveway. "Little boy, little girl, come here," she says. We grab some sort of sticks for weaponry, garage closes, and we run inside. We watch through the window. The lady gets into the car and just zooms away. Of course, nobody else is there. Her dad is at work, mum with brothers at practice, and we watch them pull into the neighborhood again and stop in front of the house, twice. Looking back on this, I'm terrified to think about what could have happened if my girlfriend didn't make us go into the house. We kept track of every car we didn't recognize after that, and we were much more careful from that point on. So this is, to this day, my strongest paranormal experience, and although I believe it can be rationally explained because I was 3 years old at the time, on the other hand, I remember the event very clearly, and it feels very real every time I think about it. So as a kid, I used to wake up in the middle of the night a lot, take my blanket and go to my parents' bed. This night was no different. I woke up, got out of bed, and left the blanket half hanging from the bed so that I could just take it with me easily. I opened the door out of my bedroom, and then I accidentally fell on the ground. The weird thing, though, was that I felt like something was holding both of my ankles. So I flipped on my back to see what was holding me, and that was when I saw it. The thing was completely dark, but thanks to the streetlight, I could just see its shape. It resembled a human, but I knew immediately that it definitely was not a human figure. I could see its dark arms, which were unbelievably long, stretching through the whole room and holding my ankles. The creature was really tall, something around 2.5 meters, or 8.3 feet or something. The creature also had a head, pitch black as the rest of the body. However, I could very clearly see two glowing red dots that I suppose were eyes, but I'm not too sure. I felt relatively calm, which was weird, until I looked in the eyes. And that was when the creature started pulling me. I grabbed the doorframe and the sill and tried to pull myself out of the room. It was difficult, but thankfully the creature's pulling wasn't too strong. It eventually stopped holding me, so I managed to get on my feet and close the door. The next morning, I woke up in my parents' bed. I went to my room. The creature obviously wasn't there, but the blanket was in the same place that I left it. Since then, I was expecting it to return at some point, but it never appeared again. Now, I'm not saying that this is all real. It could very well just be my childhood imagination, but like I said, every time I think about it, the night just feels very, very real. So at the time, I was around 6, and in Ireland, I would be in senior infant school, I think. I think first grade in America, but I could be wrong. But I remember this day well, and while some things are a little blurry as it happened about 12 years ago, I can remember most of it pretty well. School had just finished for the day, and I was waiting for my parents to come and pick me up. Both of them work, so I was used to waiting for them. I was waiting about 10 minutes, I'd say, outside the school gates, and out of nowhere, this huge woman came up to me and grabbed my arm, insisting that she was a friend of my mother's, and said something along the lines of, "I know where your mother is." Being a dumb child, I believed her and followed her. She guided me up to the church directly beside my school. Her car was in the parking lot of the church. She opened the car door and threw me in. This obviously hurt, and I was confused as to why my mother's friend would hurt me like that. It was at this point that I knew that something was wrong. She also didn't get into the car, but locked the door and waited outside of the car, looking around as if she was waiting for someone. I thought of all the stranger danger warnings I was taught as a child at this point. I began to cry and try to open the door, but, of course, nothing happened. I remember looking down at my Winnie the Pooh backpack and my eyes being blurry with tears. And the next thing I knew, I heard arguing from outside the car, and I looked to my left. And there was my best friend's mother shouting at this woman to let me go and threatening to call the guards or the police if she didn't. I heard the woman saying that I was her daughter and she wouldn't let me go. Looking back on this part, I actually laugh a bit because I was a very pale white child and this woman was black. So I'm not sure how her argument could have made any sense in her own head. After a lot of shouting though, the woman unlocked the door and let me go. I assume because I was too much hassle. I was in tears and I just ran away and I saw my mother and ran. My mother asked the woman what happened, and this woman flat out lies to my mother and my friend's mother, saying that she was told to pick me up from school by a friend, then got in her car and just left. But one of the worst parts about it is my mum actually believed her, and to this day insists that this incident never happened, even though my friend and his mother remembered it, so it definitely couldn't be a dream. I don't know what would have happened to me or who this woman was waiting for after she locked me in the car, but I'm very grateful for my friend's mother as I could definitely owe her my life. When I was 16, I became a dementia care worker, making me one of the youngest in the country doing so. I came from Scotland, and the legal age of adulthood here is 16, so working more adult jobs at that age isn't really that uncommon. Unlike more care homes, though, the one that I worked in was actually a renovated mansion. It was originally a regular care home, but by some strange decision it was decided that it would take dementia patients too, which was honestly a pretty horrible choice. The regular doorways, for instance, could hardly fit our equipment, and there was basically no room for the things that we had to do in bedrooms for some patients. It was honestly the worst place that could have housed those kinds of patients, but that was really only the beginning of everyone's worries. Everyone who worked in this home, old or young, would all vow that the place was just undoubtedly haunted. Now, usually when it comes to haunted places, there are at least some skeptics. but not here, which was odd. The place was just so active, even veteran doctors in the 40s and 50s couldn't deny the strange things that happened there, which I think says a lot about how active the building actually was. The thing that was spoken of the most, and seen the most too, was the children. It's historical fact that 2 young children died in the home many years ago. I think around the late 1800s, of some kind of sickness when the mansion was still a family home. To my knowledge, the family didn't go on to have any more children and moved out soon after. Honestly, when I heard this story, I kind of just sort of shrugged it off because it was like any Victorian-era sob story. But it was definitely a bit different when I started to come face to face with it all. My first experiences were pretty gentle and things I easily explained away, although I must admit that I did believe in the paranormal. Things like door slamming, footsteps, the feeling that someone was just behind you, etc. Regular spooky things that most haunted homes have, or at least you hear about. That was until the buzzers began to go wild. In this specific home, we all wore pages on our belts that were hooked onto an alarm system of buttons and pressurized mats all around the home, so if a patient pressed a button or fell onto their mat, we could immediately be alerted and could run to their aid. It was an okay system, but the mats were basically all in the wrong order, causing the pager to say room 6, but it was really room 12. It was honestly a nightmare to keep track of. And my first time around a patient's death is when I experienced the issues with the buzzers. Every time a patient got near death, the buzzers would just go absolutely haywire. I mean, our pagers would be sending the alarm non-stop all around the house, literally leading workers on wild goose chases as they continuously went off one after another constantly. It sounds fake, I know, but that's truly how we knew that a patient was going to die every time. It was like a warning of some kind almost. And when they died, I kid you not, every time, their buzzers would continue to go off for a few days before they just stopped. It was normal to me eventually when I worked there, but looking back, I can't believe how unbelievably spooky of a thing that was. Anyway, a lot of other weird things happened in that place. Like I said, everyone just kind of accepted that the place was haunted, but these incidences have always just kind of stuck with me. In mid-July of 2017, me and my best friend, John, went for a road trip into another town to visit my good friend and colleague, Chris. We stayed for 2 nights, but the second one was the one which I'll remember to the day that I die. So, I'd like to begin with the place that we rested our eyes. It was a really old house. Chris told me that it was probably 150 plus years old, and it was his heritage from his aunt. No one lived there, but nevertheless, he would throw some mini-parties rarely in the past, but nothing too special. The house itself was constructed in the 1800s during the Ottoman era, but the really scary part was that it had a secret room when families would hide from the Ottomans' cruelty. However, me and John didn't know where it was, and we didn't even want to know if I'm being honest. So, the night came in all of her glory. It started as a completely normal hangout. We were laughing, drinking, and just having some fun. The time's about 12 p.m, time to get some rest for tomorrow's adventures. Chris went to sleep in a separate room. Me and John were having the late night chats just before bedtime, when we noticed in John's room, just above his pillow, a really old fresco of St. Mary. John took his phone out, snapped a photo, and that's when we knew that we were screwed, because the photo was completely blurry. Well, we were just standing in awe for a minute, realizing what the hell just happened. But sometime later, we went to our beds in separate rooms. I couldn't shut my eyes for 15 minutes because I was completely terrified. And then I heard 3 really loud knocks coming from John's room. I thought that John was messing with me at first and went to his room to see what was going on, but I saw John completely frightened in the hallway. He apparently went to my room for the same reasons. But we were both shocked, and he came to my room, and after approximately 20 minutes of talking and trying to forget everything, we heard really intense stepping sounds from the hallway. But we were so convinced that there was a thief in the house that we started shouting and stomping in the hallway ready to fight. But when we got there, there was nothing, just darkness and silence. silent. My bones were shaking and my heart was pumping. I could feel my blood in my veins. Very slowly and carefully, we checked all 4 rooms in the house, and again, nothing. Just blank. We obviously checked Chris too, but he was in a deep sleep. 15 minutes later, though, we heard the same steps approaching our room again. We were really frightened because we just couldn't tell what was real and what was fantasy, and at this point, I just wanted the night to end. But the same things happened 4 times throughout the night, hearing steps, searching for the intruder to just come up with nothing and repeat. But the interesting part, though, is that every time we searched, we couldn't hear a damn sound. Everything was just completely silent, like eerily silent. But as soon as we got in our bed, the steps were there again. This whole event lasted for a few hours, from about midnight to 7 a.m. in the morning. And those were some of the longest hours in my entire life. The next morning, we told everything to Chris, and he laughed a lot and thought that we were just lying to him. But when we told him from which room we heard the first 3 kicks, he got scared even more than us, because apparently the secret room was just under John's bed, hidden by carpet. And I must admit that when I heard this, I just got goosebumps all over my body, and I could not wait to get away from that place. I was baptized May 20th of 2018 by my cousin, who is a Methodist preacher. At the time, she was a preacher at a church outside of Wildwood, New Jersey. Even though my mum and I don't live in New Jersey, we decided to join the church anyway, since it was only a couple of hours driving distance. With me were my mum and my dad. The ride up there was fine, and we took the same route we always take. I can't tell you the highway names or the numbers or even town names because I've always been bad at remembering stuff like that. But what I can tell you is that the ride back was really messed up. So we got on a stretch of highway that we'd been on numerous times before. My mum knows the way to and from Wildwood by heart, but always has Google Maps up on her phone as backup, just in case. And as we went along, things just got really weird. It wasn't something that I could put my finger on right off the bat, but there was this really intense feeling of just unease in the environment around us. Eventually I realized just how quiet it was, and my dad talked from time to time, but when it was silent, the whole world was silent too. Even the car engine was eerily silent. After a while, I realized that the highway and the trees around us had stopped looking normal. The highway itself was just a straight road for miles and miles ahead of us. No signs, no bends, no curves, no exits, no place to make a U-turn, and no buildings off in the distance. The sky and the trees, too, they look grey. But not a rainy day kind of grey, just a nearly colourless grey. I looked over at my mum's phone, which still had maps up, and realised that we were being directed to make a U-turn at some unseen turn-off. Looking at maps, there was nothing around us, just one long straight highway. The last thing that I realised was the lack of any other cars, too. For the past 15 minutes or so, there hadn't been a single car on the desolate, pin-straight highway. And just as I noticed that, Mum and Dad both realised that something was very wrong. Mum said that she must have missed the exit. Dad said that he hadn't seen a single exit for the longest time. I mentioned how the annoying robot chick from the maps hadn't spoken a word in forever. And that's what really set the tone for my mum, since that robot voice was something of a running joke with us. We sat in a very uncomfortable silence for a few more minutes until finally we saw a car. Then another, and signs started reappearing, and we found a place to turn around and eventually found our exit. Even the colour came back to the world around us, which was so strange. I've tried talking about this with my parents a few times since it happened. My mum never adds anything to the conversation. Sometimes it seems like she's just highly disturbed by it. My dad and I talked about it once, though, which made him really uncomfortable. And nowadays, he just changes the conversation to something else when I try. I've come to the conclusion that us realizing that something was wrong is probably what snapped us back into our reality. If we hadn't, how long would we have been on that highway? That's anyone's guess, I suppose. Would it have gone on forever with us blissfully oblivious to the surreal world that we somehow slipped into? My biggest fear is that there was something at the end of that highway, and if we had made it to the end, there would have been no coming back. But rethinking what I just told you guys, I realized that there's no real way to capture the eeriness and the dread that we felt in that moment. I guess the best thing to compare this to is the sudden silence that people associated with the missing 411. If anyone has had a similar experience, though, or has heard of one, please let me know, because I would like to know more. I'm still very disturbed by what happened, and it's been over a year since we went back to New Jersey, and I know that we're due for another trip very soon with a family reunion on the way, and honestly, I'm pretty afraid that it will happen again. So, I saw a thing in or near the woods on 3 separate occasions now. Each time I saw this thing, it was in a different state along the east coast of America, and each time the sighting was just fleeting. I'm in my 30s now, and the sightings have several years between them. The first time I saw it was in high school, and this is most definitely the time that I got the longest look at it. The second time I only caught a glimpse, and I'm pretty sure, but not entirely sure, that it was the same thing. The third time I got a clear look at it from a distance, but it caught me so off guard that I stumbled as I was taking a step and I lost sight of it. I've been calling it a thing because I have no idea what it is, and quite honestly, I don't even have a good guess either. It was not a Sasquatch, a wild man, a rake, a lizard person, or any other creature that I found through my incredibly frustrating recent internet research on the subject matter. But maybe a shapeshifter of some kind, because the first time I saw it, the thing changed its form for sure. Yes, I said that it changed its form. If you're someone like me that relies on science for validation, then please try to keep an open mind, but I know that you also tend to explain away people's paranormal encounters for any number of different reasons. Heck, I did the same. Also, I would have expected that if I ever did end up seeing something otherworldly, it might be something that someone else had seen before, right? I might see something that I recognize from television or movies, and I might say, look up there, that's a UFO, or holy crap, that's a ghost. Maybe it's Bigfoot. But this thing, though, this thing was just so surreal and so deranged, I'm really at a loss. This post is the first time that I've put out any of this to anyone, and if it weren't for this last encounter, then I would have forgotten the first 2 again. I've never mentioned this to anyone because of just how ridiculous it sounds, I know. The fact that I have no proof and the fact that I'm a known fuckabout, I'm pretty much exactly the person that you might think would make something like this up. At this point, though, I only want to get this off my chest to hopefully find out if anyone else has ever seen this thing. But before I begin telling you what happened, I would like to make it clear that I swear what you're about to hear is the truth about what I saw as best as I can remember anyway. If you don't believe, that's fine. Whatever, I get that. This is the reason I'm posting what happened here, and it's also the reason that I have never, and will never, tell anyone I might have to see in my daily life. I'm sure that they would think that I'm crazy or just desperate for attention because what I saw is just downright absurd. And well, now that I've thoroughly destroyed any credibility I may have once had, I'll tell you guys what I saw as best as I can. I have been thinking a lot about exactly how I might explain this to someone a while now, so I'll do my best to keep out of narrative tone. And so, I'll attempt to explain the details about what I saw as bluntly as possible with as vivid of a recollection as I have of the events. So, the first sighting was in southern New Hampshire, 2000 or 2001, summer probably, I don't remember exactly when, but well after midnight. So, I'm going to take some time to explain this first encounter in as much detail as I can recall, even though it all happened so fast, literally lasting in a total of maybe 10 seconds. It's still the longest amount of time, though, that I've spent truly looking at this thing. So, I was walking to a friend's house from the apartment complex that I lived in late at night. To get from one place to the other quickly, you had to cut through a small patch of forest, roughly 100 yards, that was technically somebody else's property. A couple of times before, we had someone shine a light on us, and once he fired a shot in the air to try and scare us in an attempt to get us to stop cutting through there. It never did stop us, but it was a good attempt, I must admit. It did, however, teach me to be stealthier when cutting through, and so, on this night, I was creeping very quietly through the trees as I went. The forest was in a valley between my apartment complex, some houses, and the neighborhood where my friend lived. The valley dipped down into the middle with a steep incline surrounding it, and so at first, I had to go down into the valley, and then at the end, I would walk up out of the valley, exiting the tree line right onto the street where this house is. Once exiting the tree line, one would be standing on the side of the street with the end of the road about half a mile to your right, I'd say, and the entrance to the neighborhood about the same distance on the left. The houses were spaced apart decently, so the night was very dark except for the area around the houses and a couple of light circles under the orange streetlights, of which there were very few for the amount of space. So I got through the valley with no problem this time, and I got up some speed to go up the hill in front of me where the forest ended, maybe 5 feet from the edge of the street, if even that far. And at the exact moment that I came out of the tree line and onto the edge of the road, something caught my eye to the left of me, emerging from the woods across the street. It stumbled awkwardly out of the dark woods and into view right at the edge of the circle of the orange light radiating down from one of the streetlights. At first, and for just a brief moment, it looked like a shadow. However, I heard a sound coming from the dead leaves beneath its feet, and I quickly realized that it was definitely not a shadow. Its body shape was like that of a starving child, maybe 3 feet tall, that you might see in a third world country, but its legs and arms were so thin that there appeared to be no way that it could support the creature's body weight. It was dark, but from what I can remember, at the end of its frail-looking limbs were just nubs. No hands and no feet that I could see. Its movements, though, were the creepiest part, honestly, and they were the first thing that threw me off. I can't even really explain just how absurd and unnatural its movements were, or how it was standing on those tiny legs. It moved forward from the trees and toward the street extremely awkwardly with a couple of steps that I saw it take. It moved forward from the trees and toward the street extremely awkwardly with a couple of steps that I saw it take. It was almost as if it was not supposed to be walking around like that, but it had somehow figured out a way to do it regardless. The thing was roughly 2 or 3 feet tall, with an enlarged light bulb-shaped head, and a little belly in spite of how thin the rest of its frame was. In addition to its shape and motion, the thing seemed unreal, and mostly because it didn't seem to reflect any light at all when it stepped into the light of the street lamp. It appeared to have no three-dimensional form at all with its body, almost blending right into its shadow, and I could only really tell that it had a solid form by the way it moved and navigated the environment around it. I froze in place instantly when I saw it, with my brain unable to even process what I was seeing. In a couple of steps, it exited the trees, stumbled across the patch of grass to the street, and then just sort of fumbled down forward toward a sewer drain on the side of the road. I'm not sure what I did, if I did anything at all, but as soon as it hit that curb, it rose back up and looked over at me. I couldn't see its face or anything at all, still just this bizarre black shape moving so unbelievably awkwardly. I really can't stress this enough too. Its movements were just ridiculously uncoordinated. But what happened next is what sent me fleeing into the woods with all of the cowardice that has kept me alive to this day. Upon seeing me, this malformed shadow child thing did this quick twisted turn toward me, dropping down on all fours and becoming a much more animal-like shape when it did. I, again, have no idea how to describe the motion as it was just so unnatural, but when its turn was complete, the thing had become something I can only describe as a shadow dog or cat or bear or something. I know that sounds crazy, but I can't describe it any other way than that. It stood on all fours like a predatory animal, but I just couldn't make out any definition on it with the way it didn't catch the light that it was standing directly below. This thing, it didn't just go from being human-like to being a human on all fours. I mean, it genuinely became something else as far as I could tell. I also debated leaving this next part out because, well, it just slices into the credibility of the events even further, but it did happen, so here it goes. As soon as the creature had hit all fours and was no longer humanoid, its eyes flashed yellow at me, and then it let out a shriek or a growl, but it wasn't quite a growl or a bark or a snarl. Not an animal-like roar either, or even a hissing, but a legitimate shriek that sounded like neither a person nor quite an animal. The sound started quiet too, and then rose quickly, almost as if it was winding up or under pressure and just painfully being forced out of the creature's mouth at great anguish. Its scream had a certain harshness to it, as if it might have had something seriously wrong with its vocal cords, or it had just smoked 1,000,000 cigarettes consecutively. I remember the thing had a weird, almost scared vulnerability to the sound it made, which contrasted the harshness in the tone as well as the defensive stance the creature took. All of this took place in just a few seconds too, maybe 10 at most, from the time the thing exited the tree line to the time it turned, postured and shrieked at me, and sent me running without a single thought in my head right back into the woods. Now, I did not stop, and I did not look back. I didn't try to be quiet through the forest. I just ran as fast as I could. And that is definitely correct. I was so scared that I ran into the dark, scary woods to get away, only realizing how dumb that was sometime afterward. The sound it made chilled me to my core then, but now in hindsight, I think the flashing eyes bother me more than the sound because it seemed so expected. The flashing or glowing eyes trope is precisely what I've heard in so many other people's stories that I've never believed about mysterious creatures they claim to have encountered. I mean, because that is what scary things in the night do, right? They flash yellow eyes and make scary shrieking sounds at you, obviously. But what else would they do, right? I never made it to my friend's house that night, though, and I never mentioned this to anyone ever since. In fact, I even managed to forget about this experience pretty quickly. Although I'm not quite sure how, because my life was high drama at the time, so I'm sure it's because I did something stupid that took over my world. Either way, this was not the last time that I would see it. The second sighting was in Central Florida, 2006 in spring, I believe, early at night at about 8 p.m. The second sighting is much briefer, and as I mentioned before, I'm 90% sure it was the same thing, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll keep this short though and tell you simply that I was out camping, went for a walk along a trail, and was watching my girlfriend hop from rock to rock across the river. I heard a sound to my left, and when I turned to look, I saw an extremely thin, skinny black nub leg, or possibly a tail, I don't know, disappear behind a tree as if it was an animal running away from something. I ran over this time, determined to see what it was, but I found nothing, and I didn't mention it to my girlfriend. No experiences or weird sounds that night either, and no more encounters for several years. The third sighting was Eastern Shore of Virginia, June 8th, 2019, late at night at about 11 p.m. So finally, here's the reason I felt that I had to put this out there, and the reason I'm so freaked out by this thing. It's not so much what happened last week, as it was just another quick glimpse and nothing else, but instead it's the fact that it happened again to me, and as far as I know, nobody else. So last week I was at a party at a friend's house, celebrating her birthday because she's one of those people in their 30s that still gets excited about those things. I don't drink, so I wasn't drunk, but in the interest of total transparency, I have been known to partake in the occasional medicinal herb supplement for recreational purposes. You can take that information however you like, but my friend lives with her husband in a farmhouse surrounded by open fields for a couple of acres in any direction, surrounded of course by a thick forest. I'd been there for a while at this point, and the thing was honestly the furthest thing from my mind at the time. But we were all just hanging out and rambling on about the usual inane bullshit. I decided that I wanted to smoke, so I went out the front door and onto the porch. I stepped forward and went to step down the front steps to get a little more space, and as I did, I glanced up out into the field in front of the house. And there it was, roughly 50 yards out and bumbling through the field toward the trees. For a split second, I could see the unmistakable shape of this weird shadowed child thing. It was just the same as before. Large head and belly, unbelievably thin arms and legs, and again reflecting absolutely no light at all. I was mid-step when I glanced up and lost track of where I was stepping, causing me to fall forward. I managed to catch myself as I fell barely, and I must have made a sound when I did, because when I looked back up, the thing was on all fours, quickly running like a dog off into the woods. I want to reiterate too that this thing did not move on all fours like a person in any way, but it moved more like an animal with knees bent backward or something. I was too far away, and it happened too fast for me to tell if it had hands and feet this time. I started to walk out and look around a bit when somebody else came outside, and not wanting to tell anyone, I just went back to the party. I must have been distant the rest of the night because I just couldn't get it out of my head this time. I ended up leaving the party relatively early and went home to start obsessing about it, as I have been for about a week now. So, obviously, I'm sufficiently freaked out by a lot of things about what I've seen. Even discounting the second sighting, I got 2 brief but very good looks at something that, honestly, I just cannot explain. And one of the things that bothers me most about this is, why me? Why, as far as I know, have I been the only one to see this thing? If it knows of me and is following me or something like that, then why does it seem surprised by my presence each time that I've seen it, and then enter a sort of fight or flight mentality? If it doesn't know of me, then why am I the only one to see this thing, and now in 3 different states years apart? I just have so many questions. I've been writing this over a few days to make sure I have got all the details as best as I can remember, and I hope that I'm not the only one that saw this creepy little fucker. What I saw that night was so unnatural. I never expected to see anything like that in my life, and it honestly just did not belong in our physical reality, and it almost did not even seem to fit in the environment around it, as if it's something 2D superimposed into an authentic 3D background. I have looked into shadow people videos and sightings, but I just don't think that this is what that was, as there was nothing ghostly about what I saw. It was just there and had a solid form. This thing was just so out of place, but at the same time, I definitely saw it there and heard it as well. And quite honestly, I really don't know what else to say about it. Each time, except the second, I could see enough of it too that I could tell it was not somebody messing with me, and I could see enough of it to say that it did not belong here in this world with us. My best guess at this point is that it and I have crossed each other's paths in a possible interdimensional rift or time slip, only because of how surreal the experience was though. And trust me, I know how crazy that sounds. But it's all I've come up with to rationalize the fact that this thing did not fit into its surroundings in just any way. It didn't even look like it was made to move and get around in this world. I mean, the force of gravity should have for sure crushed its skinny legs under the weight of its body. It was like an eggplant on toothpicks almost. Anyway, that's all there is for me to tell you guys, but I sincerely hope someone else saw something like this so that I know that I'm not starting to lose it. At this point, I only want to know that I'm not alone and that what I saw has some sort of explanation, rational or not, because I don't even care. Just give me something to go on at this point. All I need is one reasonable answer from somewhere at this point, because I know what I saw, and I can't get the way this thing moved or how dark it was out of my head. When I, 22 and female, was a college freshman 4 years ago, I just had some really scary paranormal experiences that I'd like to share with you guys. For weeks I was having these just horrible nightmares. I had a room at the time, and my bed was against the left side of my room. My roommate's bed was against the right side of the room, and there was a mini fridge in between the beds that we used as a sort of bedside table of sorts. The beds were high off the ground because we had storage underneath. Not as high as bunk beds, but definitely high enough that we had to jump to get into them. So one night, during this series of nightmares, I was in a deep sleep. I remember being stirred awake for no reason, but my eyes were still closed. I was laying on my right side, facing the middle of the room. I was barely conscious, but I remember feeling the sensation of my covers being tugged and my body moving along with them, and my right arm was outstretched. The next thing I know, too, I wake up to the literal dead weight of my head slamming against the mini fridge. I immediately jumped into my roommate's bed asking, "Help me, help me," and my right ear was ringing and behind my right ear was gushing blood. I'm 22 years old now, and this was the only time that I've ever fallen out of bed. If I had rolled out of bed, wouldn't I have landed face down or on my left side? But I landed on my right side, which was the side I was sleeping on, which leads me to believe that I was actually pulled. The bedside table wasn't directly next to my bed either. It was equally between my roommate's and I's bed at a decent distance. Also, the angle at which I hit my head was just so obscure. The impact of the mini fridge hit the backside of my right ear, and I wish that I could post the picture to just show the severity of the injury. I almost had to get stitches, in fact, and it was a very difficult area to bandage. It was just so strange, and what do you guys think? I was going for a job interview under the title of Marketing and Campaigns, good salary, and they seemed great on their supposed site. From applying to getting an interview, it was around 2 working days max, so pretty quick. I'm a 5'4" woman in her early 20s, and I'm fairly attractive and in good shape. I feel that this may matter for the context of the story, so it's the only reason I mention it. So today I was walked to the interview place, and as soon as I got in it, I had this feeling in my gut that something was just not right. But the offices were actually one small room where there was a reception corner, a desk of some sort, a tiny makeshift waiting area, and then the interviewer and the candidate next to it. And there was no privacy, and all the candidates could match the others' interviews. But the place looked weird too, and barely furnished. There were branded purchases bags like Chanel and Pandora along the wall, and there were some vague printed accolades on the walls. The only staff there was a woman at reception and a woman interviewing, both attractive, young, and well-dressed. At this point, I just felt something was wrong, so much so, in fact, that I took a picture of the office to jokingly send to my group chat. To me, it seemed like an attempt to seem fresh or modern and appealing to the young average woman. The interviews were only 15 minutes each, with no opportunity to ask questions. I watched 2 girls go before me, both of which had nothing in common academically or experience-wise to me. Again, a bit weird for the position and the salary. When it was my turn, I sat through a confusing 15 minutes of vague info on them wanting to grow us into senior management, and it sounding less and less like what I applied for. I was shown a sketchy-looking presentation on a MacBook, which, after it was on the last slide, was quickly turned away from me. In this presentation, they made big claims about who they had worked for, but no info on what they actually had done and what the role was. They apparently were interviewing 45 women today, then shortlisting 5 for an intro day this coming Monday, where they'll decide to hire you on the day. I still made sure to give a good interview, but immediately knew that I didn't want a job because something just felt wrong. When I got out and I had time to process, I realized the office I'd been in, which had apparently been there for months, had no online paper trail and no signposting on the front to suggest that their company was even there. I also looked at what I thought was their pretty nice and trendy site, but suddenly there was a new paid ad on Google under the supposed brand name that I searched for, but for a different MLM-style company with a different name with a £250 joining fee. This site had poor English and barely worked. It was definitely sketchy. The phone number that they'd given me was seemingly a dummy, as that number was for a totally different and unrelated company in the area. The woman that I had met had very common names, and when they emailed me about the interview, the boss that I had met had a totally different name too, despite it being her doing the emails. Also, the second lot of interviews on Monday that they had mentioned in the interview, they gave no information on it, apart from it being from 11:30 a.m. to around 8:30 p.m. or later, and there would be 5 chosen candidates. And so, I decided to call the police non-emergency number when I got home and gave them as much info as I could. The guy on the other end took it very seriously and explicitly told me to not attend anything they invited me to, as this whole situation seemed really strange, and they are currently investigating. Funnily enough too, I got a call back an hour ago now from the company congratulating me and inviting me back for the day on Monday. I asked them to send me the info so that I could consider and send a response after dinner with family. And in the email they sent, they told me to go back to the office that I was at today, but there was no other staff there or space for a work environment, and to bring a warm coat to meet clients. Now, this was a bit weird because it's very hot in my part of the UK currently, and why would they introduce people who don't even have the job yet to their clients? If they just moved here from London a few months ago, the need for a warm coat would still seem irrelevant, and it suggests that you'd be going to a different location, which led me to believe that something is definitely seriously wrong with this. Part of me will admit that I was tempted to go and film this thing to see what happens, if at best it was a scary 10-hour hard sell on MLM or something worse. However, due to the police advice, I politely declined their offer, citing my other genuine interview on Tuesday as my reasoning. I also made a friends-only Facebook post about the situation in case any of my local friends are applying for the same thing, and I am otherwise trying to stay low on this on my public profiles. To be honest with you guys, I think I just had a run-in with, at minimum, a very creepy MLM scam, or at worst, a potential human trafficking scam. But the town is near to one of the UK's biggest crossover points to France, meaning in a few hours you could be anywhere. I am shaken, and my gut feeling is my best reminder that I may have escaped a very scary situation. Please be safe out there, guys. I'm not a firm believer in the paranormal by any means, but I do think that there's something out there, and I'm open to discussion because there are a few things that I've experienced that I just can't explain logically, and this is one of them. I don't remember most of my childhood very well, but this memory is as clear as day. I was 8 years old and it was summer break. I wasn't really social, so I spent most of my out-of-school time playing games. I was playing Bone, out from Boneville. In retrospect, not that good of a game, but I absolutely loved it. I played it dozens of times, even though there was nothing really new to discover. When my mum came home from work, she looked pretty serious and told me that my grandfather, from my dad's side, had unfortunately died. I was devastated and cried a lot. Although I didn't live with my father, my grandpa was a person that I was really close to. The next day, I played Bone again. As I stated before, I had played this game a lot, so it didn't seem weird. And when my mum came home from work, she told me that my grandfather died. Again. I thought she might be stressed from work and had forgotten that she's really told me that, so I told her, "Yeah, I know, you said that yesterday." But she said that was impossible because she only learned about it today. Needless to say, I was pretty freaked out by this. So, me and my partner moved into this old house. We lived with the landlord and his family, but in our own studio flat with a bathroom down the hall. It was nice at first, but then things just started getting odd, and quite honestly, I'm a bit terrified. During Christmas, I remember I came home from work as I was ill. I arrived back at 3:30 and my partner was still up at this point and all the cupboards were open. I asked him why did he do that, and he said that he didn't. He was playing League of Legends on Ranked, but once he's on, he never gets off for hours, so I actually believed him. I kind of passed the whole thing off though, so I just closed them all and I laid in bed. My boyfriend went to go out to the bathroom, and when he came back, he questioned why I opened all the cabinets. See, I was on my phone the entire time though, and these cabinets are silent, so you can't hear them when you open them. The Christmas tree lights had just turned off, and we spent the rest of the night just kind of sitting there whimpering. This all continued, and we just did our best to ignore it, trying not to think much of it. But a few weeks after this, things started getting dropped on me and my partner's face when we were asleep. There would be shoes, bottles, random heavy objects. It was more annoying than scary, and a month goes by and it's quiet again. My boyfriend's mum, Polish woman, very Catholic, suggested that we go to a church and seek help there. I disagreed to it because I didn't think it was a demon or anything, and they wouldn't help us anyway. Random objects were thrown at my partner, though, and he would start blaming me for it. Arguments got frequent, and so did the activities. Now, my partner needed to go back to Poland for a week, so I was alone for some time. I can't sleep at night alone for personal reasons, so I slept during the day and was active at night. 2 days after my boyfriend left, 3 to 4 a.m., someone would knock on our door, and there would be someone walking in circles upstairs for hours too. It sounded like they had shoes on with some sort of rubber on it as it squeaked. My partner comes home after the week had gone, and it was about 10 p.m, and I was expecting him to be back at about 12. I was in the bath. I'd like to mention too that the bathroom was now an ensuite rather than down the hall, and I submerged myself under the water. And it was at this point that I felt someone's hand pull my hair, and I panicked, got out of the bath and screamed at my boyfriend for scaring me like that. But he wasn't home. He was stuck in the airport due to the lines still. And honestly, I felt my heart drop to my stomach as I didn't immediately think ghost, and I heard our door open and shut, which is why I assumed it was my boyfriend. I went around the house and checked the wardrobe and outside my door and everywhere, but there was no one around. I asked the landlord to check CCTV, and all we saw was the door open and shut. No one came in and no one left except me when I was checking. A few nights ago too, our bathroom door opened slowly and then slammed. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a thump and turned around to my boyfriend upset as he was awoken to a paperweight being chucked at him. He had a huge bruise on his forehead too, and he knew that it wasn't me as he woke up instantly and I was facing the opposite direction. Which leads me to my question, what is happening to us? Why is this thing just so aggressive? I'm scared, and I know feeding fear to this thing is the worst thing you can do, but how am I not to be scared? I mean, what's happening is terrifying. I worked graveyard shift for a long time, and one night about 25 years ago, I'd finally caught up with my night's work, but was unable to back up the work that I had done. So I decided to clock out and drive to the Walmart to buy a box of new discs and leave the receipt for our bookkeeper so she could reimburse me. A few days after this incident, though, we learned that our computer had a virus that was corrupting the floppy disks that we were using. Go figure. So, you get the picture, though. Floppy disks for backup, no cell phones for most of us, and it was a primitive time. So, I arrived at the Walmart at about 3 a.m, went in and found the discs. I decided to visit the toy department as it was early November and I wanted to get Christmas gift ideas for my son, as well as several nieces and nephews too. Well, while I browsed, I felt someone watching me, and I looked around and there were 3 men nearby, and all were just kind of staring at me. I looked back at them long enough to fix their appearances in my mind and went on looking at toys. I was in no hurry though. I mean, I was off the clock and wouldn't need much time to back up my work after I got back to the office, so I continued to look around, even strolled through housewares for a few minutes. Every time I looked over my shoulder though, those 3 guys were just close and watching me. After the second time, alarms were sounding in my head. I mean, they were repellent looking with pasty pale faces, as if they spent all their time indoors eating junk food, and their eyes were cold and hard. But what disturbed me the most though was the way that they were dressed, much too warmly for the weather that night. Even though it was November, it was about 55 outside, and I was perfectly comfortable in a jean jacket. These guys were in heavy coats, suitable for sub-freezing temperatures though, and they had been buttoned to their necks inside the store. The only reason that I could think of for that was that they were hiding weapons beneath their coats or something. I finally headed toward the cash register, thinking that if no one else was leaving the store when I did, that I would ask the cashier to call security and request an escort to my vehicle. As I reached the register, I saw my stalkers standing just inside the doors. They muttered among themselves for a moment, and then they exited the store. As I was paying, a man and a woman lined up behind me. I had seen them shortly before I neared this register, and they didn't seem to be paying any attention to me. I moved to the area between the registers and the doors and stood waiting for the couple, fiddling with my buttons and blowing my nose and whatnot. and when they moved towards the doors, so did I, staying just a few steps ahead of them. I had parked not far outside, and I reached my vehicle quickly, and the Stalkers were sitting in a car that was parked nose to nose with my pickup truck. I hopped in, locked the door, and then I sat back and stared at them. The couple that I had used as my unwitting escorts walked past me and the Stalkers and got into a car a few spaces away. They left, and after a minute or two, the Stalker driver said something to the others, started the engine and pulled away. I watched as they slowly left the parking lot, then ascended the nearby interstate highway overpass and took the entrance ramp. Only then did I start my engine, and I took my time looking around as the engine walked. I continued along the street for a couple of miles past the interstate, then pulled into a dark lot behind a strip mall, turned off my lights and engine and waited, watching the few vehicles that passed. I wanted to be certain that I was not about to lead those guys to my office building, which was isolated and, at that hour, usually deserted, except for me. And after my pulse slowed to normal, I restarted the truck and returned to work. I'm a female, but I'm almost 6 feet tall and weigh about 175 pounds. I know that my size has protected me from a lot of mayhem over the years. I was also armed that night too, and I carry a loaded Smith & Wesson, as well as a speed loader, which is like an extra cylinder full of bullets. But still, I probably would have been no match for 3 determined assailants, that's for sure. This experience, though, definitely cured me of my nonchalance about running errands in the wee hours of the morning and validated my conviction that any time that I get the feeling of someone's eyes crawling over me, it's wise to look around and find the reason. Because, about 3 months later, my husband and I were watching the local evening news, and they showed the photos of 2 of the Stalkers, because they were wanted for armed robbery. I work a summer job at a community pool as a pool monitor. Basically, that means that I take care of the pool by skimming it, shocking it, calling for resources, checking people in, etc. My shift starts at 11, so around that time I was skimming the pool. Eventually, this silver car pulled up and parked in the parking lot beside my car. I kind of dreaded people coming at that time because usually that means people get in while I'm still skimming, which stirs the bugs and debris around. But then I saw the guy was only going to the mailboxes. But the community's mailboxes are all in one place, like how they are in university or whatever, and it's right next to the pool parking lot. So relieved, I just continued my job. After the guy got his mail, though, he pulled the car around right next to the gated entrance to the pool, and then he entered. Each resident has a key card, so I'm guessing he was a resident or someone who knew one. Thinking that he was just some guy wanting to swim, I asked him to sign in on the book. There's a book that asks residents to list things like the resident's name, address, time they arrived, keycard number, all that stuff. I saw that he did, and so I returned to working, but then I heard him start walking toward me. He started out politely at first, saying, "Excuse me, but I just wanted to tell you that I think you're cute and was wondering if you'd like to get a drink sometime." I'm happily taken, so I informed him as much. But then he said something about my boyfriend not having to know, and I still said no thanks, but he just kept going, and he got more and more vulgar under the guise of just being up front. He said things like, "I'll be honest, I really want to have you, and I would beat your insides out." Apparently the threat just didn't register, so I just kept brushing him off, but I'm kinda affable by nature, so I was kind of just laughing it off like, "Nah, dude." He said that we could go into the bathroom right quick and no one would have to know. I told him no, that I'm a virgin. I know, probably a mistake to say in hindsight, right? And then I said that I'm not interested in doing it with a stranger. Then he asked me if I'd ever been with a black guy before. I'm white, he's either black or mixed or something, and if I'd ever seen a black guy's dick. I said no, and that I simply wasn't interested in him. Things were escalating though, and again though, I was saying it in a way that was sort of friendly because by this point, I only felt a bit exasperated by his efforts. To be fair, I have dissociation issues, so that could explain why I wasn't really reacting like I probably should have. He said that he wanted to show me his dick real quick in the bathroom, and after I finally said no for the millionth time, he finally just said, "Alright, goodbye," and just left. I had only been complaining to my mum just because I was telling her how my day went, and she was like, "That's sexual harassment, and you need to report that to your boss." After that, I was kind of like, "Oh yeah, you're right." And the more I think about it, the more I think about how wrong things just could have gone. I mean, he was really aggressive by the end of it, and I was just kind of shaking it all off like it was nothing, which was kind of stupid, I must admit. So yeah, hopefully the guy never comes back, but if he does, I'll be sure to take different steps the next time. I was born in the Bay Area in '88 and stayed there for a good 12 to 13 years, my family being part of the great Bay Area Sacramento migration of 2000 and beyond. I haven't been to the Bay since, but our last house that we lived in was a 2-story built in the 60s, if I remember correctly. I have a huge Greek or Persian family, and we're all extremely close to one another. Growing up, my mother told me that I had an imaginary friend. I was apparently too young to remember any of it, but now, after years of mind-altering consumptions, God forbid I remember what I had for dinner yesterday. But I do remember a few incidences that have haunted me to this day, and I'll never forget them. But people may call bullcrap, but I've always been sensitive to things around me. I could feel and pick up on people's energies and moods, even energies of something when I was by myself. I was fearful and hesitant to tell anyone in my family of the countless occurrences that had befallen upon me, being that 3 members in my family were diagnosed with schizophrenia and manic depression. I obviously did not want to attract any kind of attention to be associated with that. But those occurrences are for another time and perhaps another place. So our plan was to move into the place for about a year while our house in Sacramento was being built. It was a great achievement for our family to finally have a new house of our own that we could finally call home. But the house that we were staying in, I can't remember the address or the street name, but I remember the major cross street, became one of the scariest and most unnerving times in my entire life. The layout wasn't exactly a comfortable living situation, being that there were 6 of us, including my grandmother, living in a 4-bedroom house, and me being the youngest was obligated to sleep in a literal windowless storage room that was connected to my older brother's room on the 2nd floor. It was always a hot, musty, sickening feeling upon entering it, and at the beginning it was very quiet, and the only sensitivity I felt was when I had to sleep in that closet, as I called it. It just never felt right to me. It was always off. A couple of months in, too, there was a bit of anxiety throughout the house, almost as if something had awoken and was breathing down your neck. I made it a point to never go downstairs alone at night for some reason. I eventually noticed small happenings too, like lights turning on or off by themselves. When no one was in the room, mind you. Coffee cups being moved from one counter to another. Cold chills every once in a while. Doors being opened when we had closed them, etc. And then the knocks and the scratching came. My parents were very hard workers, making sure that they had enough to provide for our family, so they were rarely home. My older sister was at the age of teenage angst and rebelled on the streets. My brother was extremely into skateboarding and would hit the pavement with his neighborhood cronies almost daily after school, so my grandmother and I were the only ones home until my parents returned from work. I would always sit in my closet, watching television or playing my PlayStation, and I would hear 3 consecutive methodical knocks or very long dragged-out scratching noises that sounded like they were coming above me in the attic, and most graciously, the entrance to the attic was located in my closet. No, they were definitely not animals too, because we eventually had someone come out to investigate after my constant complaining. I, being as young and sensitive as I was, refused to go into the attic and see for myself, and the environment just sent a sharp, painful chill down my spine. Another time I was home alone, father, sister, brother, all out doing what they do, mother and grandmother at a doctor's appointment or something of that nature, shopping perhaps, I don't know. But I was on my way downstairs to the kitchen, and in that house, the stairs going up lead to an enormous open space with an opening to see down to the front family room. For some reason, too, I'd always look over the ledge to the first floor to see if someone was there. Don't ask me why, it was just something that I did. And this time, I caught a glimpse of someone rushing into the kitchen from the stairs. Whom, or whatever it was, moved incredibly fast too. I called out, "Mum?" But there was nothing. "Mama?" Nothing again. I worked up the courage to go and confront whatever it was, and I began the descent to the second floor as quietly as possible. When I was on the third or fourth step from the bottom, I heard a dish breaking in the kitchen. The loud crash startled me, obviously, and I looked to the second floor, my mind filled with the indecision of whether I should continue, and I did. My heart was beating so hard and so fast that you could literally see my chest thumping to each strained pump. But alas, I was in the doorway to the kitchen ever so carefully. I don't know what I expected to see. Working up the nerve, I finally turned the corner into the kitchen, but when I did, nothing was there. Except a broken mug that had been left out on the kitchen island by either my mother or father. But I remember distinctly feeling cold, almost as if a breeze had gone through me. I began to pick up the broken pieces of the mug when I heard a loud slam of a nearby door closing, and I booked it, ran as fast as I could up the stairs to the safety of my windowless closet. But I can confirm that there was definitely no one home. After that experience, I was plagued by similar occurrences such as that, but I won't get into all of that because that would take forever to explain. Now, it was about a couple of months before our big and final move to our house in Sacramento. My parents had gone up to Sacramento, dealing with the necessary things involved in buying a house. My grandmother was visiting family in Canada at the time, so my sister was in charge of babysitting my brother and I. And lo and behold, she went out to a friend's party, spending the night, and left my brother and I home alone, thinking that my brother was totally capable of taking care of me. An hour had gone by, and I remember being extremely tired after a long day of video games and adolescent fun. I turned in, lying down on my bed in the closet, and slowly drifting off to sleep. And I had awoken about an hour later to use the bathroom, and walk through my brother's room. Was also sound asleep, softly snoring, and I remember my closet was connected to this room. I relieved myself, though, and returned to my bed. My TV had been on, so I decided to turn it off, and thus I was now in a pitch-black room with no light, no windows, and, I remind you, no way out. I also had trouble sleeping when I was younger, so my method was to close my eyes and imagine the things that I was going to do the next day. A few minutes went by when I felt just this chill and anxiety and the uneasiness again, only this time it was extremely thick. And then I heard slow, long scratching again coming from my ceiling where the attic was. And I just thought to myself, not again. I pulled the blankets up to my nose as if there was some magical blanket that would make me invisible, when the scratching stopped abruptly. And for some reason, I became even more scared, even more nervous, and even more paranoid. I could hear my brother softly snoring in the next room, as he does when he enters REM sleep. I took some comfort in that, but then I hear a jiggle on my door handle, the sound of someone placing their hand on it, and I look towards the door. And my door slowly opens ajar, and the wider it becomes, the more moonlight I can see from my brother's windows. The door was completely open now, and what I saw in the doorway, standing there, completely silent and unmoving, was the silhouette of a very skinny, hunched woman, completely still and completely quiet. And what I remember the most was her hair, because it was sticking up at all ends and directions, completely and utterly crazy looking, like what you'd think a mental patient would look like after shock therapy or something. I began to whimper, fearing for my soul, saying the Lord's Prayer in my head over and over. She, or it, stood silently there for what seemed like an eternity, probably more like 10 seconds though. But because of the angle of the moonlight, I couldn't see any of the features other than a very disturbing smile, and I will never forget that smile as long as I live. I was about to scream for my brother, who was comfortably snoring in the next room, when she put her nails on the door and proceeded to slowly drag them downwards, creating a noise worse than nails on a chalkboard. And it was at this point that I knew that I had found the source of the scratching. I pulled my covers over my head and began to cry, and I screamed, "Leave me alone," and then immediately jumped out of the bed to confront it, but when I did, it was gone. I hurried into my brother's room, which was literally a step away from my closet, to determine if he was playing a joke on me, and I saw no evidence of him being the culprit. He was sound asleep, still softly snoring and dead to the world, curled up 3 times in a blanket-made burrito. I obviously woke him up to tell him about what just happened. All I got from him, though, was a "go the hell back to bed and let me sleep." And nevertheless, I just slept with the lights on that night. Now, I know some of you might say that it was just a dream or you experienced sleep paralysis, but I say no to that. I've had sleep paralysis incidences, and although it too was extremely terrifying, it was absolutely nothing like this. I never found out who or what that thing was. The internet wasn't anything compared to what it's like now, and in all honesty, I just wanted to forget it all ever happened anyway. If I could remember the address, I would most definitely try to dig into it more now that I'm older and I have a better grasp on myself now. Plus, the paranormal is a very interesting thing to me now. But I still get those feelings to this day, even now. The older I've gotten too, the more I kind of understand it. But that memory will forever be branded into the mushy goo that is my brain. I will forever be haunted by the memory of that woman or thing. I work in the pharmacy department of my local hospital. The hospital is one of the oldest in the country and has seen some horrors of the Troubles and conflict in Northern Ireland. This is a long and complicated history that isn't easily explained. Google has a lot of information about it if you're interested. This place has many stories too, but most of the staff who work there have a tale to tell of some form. I've been working in the hospital for 4 years now and have only just had my first experience, so here it goes. So each of the wards keep their own stock of medication, and it's part of my job to check their stock and order more if necessary. I was waiting for the lift outside Ward 4, currently a urology ward but formerly a children's ward, recently when I got overcome by curiosity looking into the old abandoned ward opposite. The old ward opposite used to be a labour ward, but use of this ward was discontinued as a new part of the hospital was built and the labour ward moved into the new building. I walked into the old ward through the door, which is old and stiff. It remains open all the time and requires a decent amount of force to close. But when I walked past the door, I peeked further into one of the old room, which was filled with random junk. I was about to turn around when I heard a child's voice behind me. I couldn't make out what it was, but it sounded to me like a toddler or a young child who hadn't learned to speak properly yet. And then I turned quickly to the door slamming shut, hard, like someone had put all their might into closing it. These doors have windows in them, and I could see straight through it into the lift area, and there was definitely no one around. And to this day, I have no idea where that voice came from or who closed the door. I also spent the rest of the day trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't. I had the strangest encounter happen to me this year, and this happened to me on my college's campus in January. So, my boyfriend and I try to go to the gym every day. Sometimes we go in the morning, and sometimes we go really late at night. Well, one night we decided to go at around 1 a.m. The gym is a 24-hour Gold's gym. And anyway, the gym is walking distance to my boyfriend's apartment too, so we walked to the gym together this fateful night. During our walk, I don't remember what it was about, but we got into an argument. When we got to the gym, I was in no mood to work out. I was upset, and my boyfriend and I were pretty much ignoring each other at this point. After 10 minutes or so, I left without telling him, which I know was a stupid idea, but we lived just a few blocks down the street, so I didn't think too much of it. It was nearly 2 a.m., it was cold, and I was by myself. I remember being kind of creeped out because not only was it late, but it was a winter break and campus was barren. But I was mad and I'm stubborn, so I just kept walking. At about 1 block away from my boyfriend's apartment, though, I felt a presence next to me, and I looked to my left, and standing underneath a tree with branches that hung low, in front of an abandoned building, was an overweight Caucasian male, completely in the nude. But that's not all, because to accompany his birthday suit, he had on one of those damn Mardi Gras masks that cover half your face. I was stunned for a second. I thought he was going to do something, but he didn't. He just kind of stood there, and after we made eye contact, he said hi and waved, and that was it. Didn't move, just stood there in the dark, naked, as he watched me walk by. Even though I was scared and shocked like never before, I refused to give him a reaction. I looked up, looked at him, stopped for a second, looked away, then just kept walking the same pace. After I knew I was out of sight, I sped walked the rest of the way back to the apartment. During the short walk between the weirdo and my destination, I phoned my boyfriend and told him about what had happened. 3 minutes later, boyfriend barged through the front door and we told his 2 roommates what happened. They all decided to run out and hunt him down with broken bottles and kitchen pans, but they never found him, and I never saw him again. Apparently, too, this guy has made multiple appearances around campus trying to scare students or something. And one student actually managed to snap a photo of him that I, hopefully, still have. About 2 years ago, when I was 17, I received a Facebook message from someone named Dan who I didn't recognize. I had mutual friends with him, and he looked to be around the same age as me, so I wasn't too alarmed. But what follows is the messages. Dan says, "Hello, how have you been? Haven't seen you in a few years." I say, "Hi, not trying to be rude, but do we know each other?" Yeah, you really don't know me?" I didn't respond. Wow, real nice way to treat a family friend. "Sorry, I just don't recognize you." Dan then sent a picture of me and him together from when we were little. And I mean really little. Like, I looked maybe 2 or 3 and he looked 5 or 6. I say, "Oh wow, did our parents used to be friends or something?" "I was your neighbor," he says. "You really don't recognize me? Come on, I didn't move that long ago." He had in fact moved a long time ago, at least 12 years in fact. So, I honestly feel like it's not that uncommon for me to not recognize someone who I hadn't seen or talked about since I was like 4. Anyways, the conversation continued like that. I apologized for not remembering him and just started catching up. He was being nice enough and I was bored, so whatever, right? No harm, no foul. After we kept talking, I started remembering more about him, though. Like, I remembered him coming over and swinging in my backyard, and me going over to his house with my big brother, and all of us hanging out together and whatnot. Dan was a few years older than me, at least 2, but I can't remember exactly. We kept talking on Facebook, though, just messaging back and forth about normal things until it started to get late and I was tired and had school the next day, so I told him that I was going to go to bed. I closed my computer and just laid down and I went to sleep. The next morning I woke up to a bunch of messages from him and things like, "Good night, beautiful, sweet dreams, message me when you wake up, are you asleep yet, can't wait to talk to you." Literally, there was almost 50 messages. In a way, I was kind of flattered, I must admit, that I was getting that much attention, but like more than anything, I was creeped out. I opened the messages and kind of glanced through them, and eventually I just didn't reply. On my phone, I have it set where I don't get notifications from Facebook Messenger. At the time, I was in a lot of group chats with different team sports and groups of friends, so it was just easier to, at the end of the day, check my messages versus getting a ton of notifications all day long. At some point, though, during the day, I had gotten more messages from him that I just hadn't noticed while I was at school, and he was saying stuff like, "Do you still live at my address?" And I did still live there. "Does your mum still freak out about hanging out with boys?" What? No, my mum never has freaked out over boys. Well, let's go out and catch up. Let me take you out and treat you right. And it just kept going on, and really random questions that weren't necessarily threatening, but just somewhat creepy, and then him talking about riding to go on dates that he didn't even live in the same state anymore that I lived in, so I had no idea how he would have planned on going on dates with me, but the whole thing was just kind of annoying in the end. The messages just kept continuing over the next week, with him telling me that he wants to go on dates and asking me really weird questions about my mum, my brother, and my house, and then he started asking about his house that he used to live in. I didn't really reply to any of his messages, but I was getting at least 50 a day at this point. I'm not sure why I didn't block him. I think I was just kind of entertained in a way, like I thought it was funny. Eventually, I brought it up to my mum and just asked her if she remembered Dan from next door. And her face completely drained of colour, and she got super serious all of a sudden, and she asked me why I was bringing him up. I told her that he had messaged me on Facebook and was trying to get me to go on a date with him and was just trying to catch up. I didn't tell her that he'd been messaging me 50 plus times a day and that I wasn't responding at this point. And she told me to block him and never message him again. I asked her why, obviously, and this is a summary of what she told me. When I was 3 or 4, I used to play over at his house a lot. His mum would always offer to babysit me if my mum had to go quickly out to run errands and shop and whatnot, and he also had a little sister who was around my age, so my mum figured that it was a perfect opportunity for a play date between Dan, my brother, me, and Dan's little sister. One day, when I came home after one of these play dates, my mum was asking me and my brother what we had done that day. My brother started talking about how we had watched some movie, I don't know what one, and I apparently told my mum that Dan had brushed my hair for me. My mum thought that was a little bit weird. I mean, what 6-year-old boy is going to want to brush a 3-year-old girl's hair? So she asked a couple more questions. She doesn't really remember the details, and I don't really remember them either, seeing as I was a toddler, but somehow it came out that he wasn't brushing my hair. He had been taking a brush and was rubbing it all over my body while I was only in my undies. I'm not going to get more explicit than that, and no, nothing more serious happened, thank God. It was more just weird than anything, but my brother didn't know anything about this because we had been in Dan's room and my brother had been in the living room with Dan's little sister. And after that, my mum never let me go back over to his house. Apparently, when my mum confronted his mum about it, a huge fight broke out. Not physically, but a screaming match. And it turns out that Dan had been doing similar stuff to his little sister, but it had escalated farther than it had with me. My mum threatened to report them to the police or Child Protective Services, as she did both in the end. But before much could be done, they moved out and found somewhere else to live. They were renting the house at the time. After hearing that from my mum, I immediately blocked Dan on Facebook. I wasn't quick enough, I guess, however, because he messaged a bunch of my friends on Facebook asking about me and had changed his relationship status to taken and in a relationship with me. He then followed me on Instagram and found my Snapchat somehow. He liked and commented on almost all of my Instagram pictures and sent me a bunch of Snapchats. And I have a feeling that you may be able to guess the kinds of pictures he sent. And I quickly blocked him on both, and luckily he never figured out my phone number. I haven't heard from him since then, and I haven't heard anything about him, but I sure do hope that I never meet Dan ever again. So I was a maintenance worker at a camping resort in the Appalachian Mountains for several years. It was more like a rich glamping resort with luxury cabins that had been renovated. But the place still had an old and rustic feel to it. It was miles from civilization too, and was super peaceful, especially during the down season. The resort was originally built during the Roaring '20s at the height of Prohibition. The Appalachian Mountains are infamous for moonshining operations, and I'm pretty sure that this resort was the center of it all back in the day. There's a locked safe room hidden underground where they used to store shine, as well as secret passages underneath some of the old caverns that were also used to store the illegal liquor. In its heyday, the resort was visited by numerous numbers of high society that came to the party with the forbidden spirits hidden underneath the resort. One night towards the end of spring, before our busy season began, I was starting to become close with a new tourist manager of the resort. Her name was Kate, and that night she wanted us to sleep outside under the stars, but it started raining. I suggested that we go sleep in the screened-in porch of one of the old cabins that hadn't been renovated yet. I thought that it would be a pretty good compromise, and we could fall asleep to the sound of the rain falling. Hey, who says romance is dead, right? After we got everything set up and did the old in and out, it was sometime past 2 a.m. She fell asleep in my arms instantly, and I laid there just kind of unable to fall asleep. I was worried that I was going to disturb her because I usually toss and turn when I have a hard time going to sleep. I figured that we'd been laying there for over an hour at this point when I heard what sounded like a door inside the empty cabin open and close. It was either the bedroom or the bathroom. Both of the old doors squeaked really loud and struggled to open and shut. I knew that they had been oiled or replaced when we renovated that cabin though, so it was weird. Honestly though, my first thought was that it was our boss, the resort owner's son. He's super nosy and has been trying to get into this girl's pants ever since he hired her. He's also very demanding and entitled. I wouldn't put it past him to fire me if he knew the two of us were seeing each other. Yet, I don't know why he would be sneaking around the resort at night, or how he would know that we were even there. It was a good-sized resort after all. I proceeded to hear footsteps coming from inside the cabin towards the door to the screened-in porch. I laid there as still as I could, waiting for the door to open and have my boss lose his short temper when he discovered us. I prayed that he would just walk away and not find us, but nothing happened. Now, there were no receding footsteps and no more door noises. I stayed up the whole night too and didn't hear another noise come from the cabin. And there was nothing there except for me, Kate, and the empty cabin. The next morning too, Kate rolled over and immediately asked me about the footsteps she heard the night before. Apparently they had woken her up, and she also stayed up all night trying to figure out where they were coming from and who they belonged to. She too was terrified and, in fact, would never go near that cabin again. Unfortunately, I had to go back to that cabin nightly. Part of my job was having to make sure all the lights were off and everything was shut down in the empty cabins at night. My boss liked to turn on the lights to the empty cabins to give the appearance like the resort had more guests than it really did. And every night that I went into the cabin after that, I always felt a sense of dread as I walked towards that cabin. I think it's because I just never figured out what was in that cabin that night. That cabin was never renovated during the 4 years I worked at the resort. There was always some excuse that the project manager had for delaying the renovation of that cabin. I didn't mind, but I did hate to go to that cabin at night. Inside the living room of the cabin, there was also a huge 175-pound swinging bed on chains that could be lifted up or down to make space for my guests staying in that cabin back in the day. Every night that I went to that cabin after we heard the footsteps, I would always open the door of the cabin and find that bed swinging on its own like someone or something had just gotten out of the bed before I got there. This story happened to me in late February of 2019, 4.5 months from the time that I'm writing this. I am a military collector and specialize in World War II rifles, rare ammo, and bayonets. It's relevant to the story, I promise. So, I live in North Carolina, and every year, I and a friend or two will make the pilgrimage to Kentucky for a large military show with hundreds of tables of museum-grade items. This year, I had taken one good friend of mine named Andrew, and nobody else was free that weekend, so it was just the two of us. Come that Sunday, we were on our way back home and had just crossed the West Virginia state line. We just passed through the Big Walker and East River Mountain tunnels for those who know that area. We came out of the second tunnel and went down a large hill, but whilst coming back up from the dip, I had noticed that as I pressed the gas, my RPMs would spike to red zone, but it had no effect on my speed. At this point, I threw my hazards on and coasted as far as I could, which was just up to an exit. We sat there, stopped for roughly 5 or 10 minutes trying to diagnose the problem and figure out how to make it home. As we had figured, it was an obvious transmission issue, but no clue as to what exactly it was. We let the car rest for a bit when a vehicle came whipping right in front of us. It was a gold-toned minivan with a South Carolina palm tree sticker in the back shield. At this point, 3 doors open, 3 people begin to jump out, but 2 pulled their legs back in, whilst one older man who appeared to be in his late 50s and likely smoked a lot, walked up to my window. He began to say that he saw us pulled over and, because he believed in Jesus, had to help us out of the goodness of his own heart because it was so cold and windy out, which it actually was. I told him that we were on our way back home to North Carolina when he proceeded to say that he was from Statesville, NC, and that they were all going home and just passing through. The man was far from alarming himself and seemed honest at first. He then said that his son was the car guy and could help. At this point, he signaled to the van that he came from, and 2 people got out. One of them, a very fat redneck-looking woman, and a skinny guy in his late 20s who was presumably his son. The younger guy was well-spoken, but definitely set off some red flags in all kinds of ways. He had sagging pants and prison tattoos covering his neck and his hands. Both guys were standing by my window talking, but just as that happened, the woman began to wave on everybody that attempted to pull over and help. In this time, the older man had begun to contradict himself and slipped out of character more and more. He told me that they were on their way back to their shop that was 5 minutes away. Red flags were going off more and more, but I still had no reason to not take their help if they could offer it. And that's when I went and grabbed my code reader from the trunk so that we could have a more or less official diagnosis. The older guy followed me around back and saw my rifles that I bought laying aside my luggage. I brought the reader to the front and plugged it in. The son had said that he could clear the code if it was an electronic issue and it would let us go on our way. But the code would not erase, and the son asked if he could sit in my car since he had nothing on but a loose t-shirt and was obviously cold. My buddy Andrew was still in the passenger seat, so I told him that he may sit on the edge to break the wind. The son then proceeds to start my car, gun it in reverse, forward and reverse again. During this, I for sure thought that my car and Andrew were off to whatever crack house these obvious drug junkies had come from. He stopped the car though, got out and said to follow them after begging me for cash so that they could get home. I told him that money was tight at the moment, but offered $20 as more or less an appeasement. Andrew and I had about 1 minute of sitting there talking and planning for any issues that may arise. During this, we kept expert communication without the junkies knowing, and whilst going over the plans and talking about what had just happened and how sketchy they were, I hear my back door open on my side and turn around to see the older guy had climbed into my back seat. I pull my knife from my door just in case, as he says that he wants to make sure that we get there, and thank God that my car was still not working as well. We coasted down the hill and had just enough energy to pull into the garage or gas station off the exit. The van pulled in as well, and the woman asked what the deal was. I explained that the car wasn't working and parked us in the lot. As soon as I exited my car, the older guy has the woman begin to hound me for cash. I explained that we didn't have a lot, which did not register with them. I went inside to buy transmission fluid, and all 3 of them came with. I had Andrew stay in the car, and as soon as we stepped foot inside, the woman began talking about locating an ATM for me to withdraw $200 for them. Keep in mind that nothing that had happened with my car working had a thing to do with them. I did pay the son the $20 I promised him, however, because he did give me honest advice of what fluid to buy and how much. The older guy then started to say how pathetic it was that I could not pay them for the work they did. Afterward, they all split up, and I called Andrew and told him to lock up and take my other knife from the door in case they went to him and where there were no cameras or something. Fortunately, they never went near Andrew, and instead the older guy yelled at the other 2 that it was time for them to go. It was 2 hours later, after a very generous young mechanic drove us around to a few shops to get the right fluid and helped us by supplying tools and a funnel to add to it, that we finally got home safely after that. That definitely may not have been the ending had the car worked fine all the way to their shop, or if I had not had my buddy Andrew, who was critical during the entire thing. Or had he not seen what I was carrying, based on the rifles in the trunk. At the time, I had no pistol on me, but after that, I bought a new Glock that goes with me everywhere because you just never know when those things will happen. So my family has a long history with living amongst Native Americans and their culture. My dad is half Native American, and my mum's side is just enthusiastic about the culture, which is kind of what led them to meeting in the first place. Anyways, my mum grew up selling crystals and jewelry in the southwest with her family. They were a large van and were a travelling shop that would basically buy out crystals and jewelry on reservations and then bring them to large cities and towns several miles away. FYI too, this wasn't exploitive, this was a deal that they had set up with several jewelers on the reservations. One night, they were driving along an Arizona desert road when the engine just overheated and stranded them miles from civilization. Before addressing the problem, my grandpa had to use the bathroom and walked over to a bush, and before he could do anything, he saw a pair of glowing red eyes, which, at the height they were standing at, he assumed it was a person. He begins to walk over and ask for help until he gets a better look at the thing, which made him run back to the car immediately. The thing was a lot taller than he had initially thought, standing at about 7 feet tall. It was covered in fur, almost like a werewolf, its face like a coyote's with human eyes. Funny enough too, almost looking like one of those animorph creatures from how my grandpa described it. But my mum and my grandparents were very well acquainted with Native American culture, and knew exactly what this was. It was a skinwalker. Now, up to this point, they'd only ever heard of them but had never seen one. My grandpa yells to my grandma to start up the van, and they drove as far as they could before the engine just overheated again. But after seeing this thing, their luck just became so bad that it was becoming hard to live. My grandparents actually split up for a little, and my grandma moved to Rome to star in a movie, as she was a decently known actress at the time. She took my 2 uncles and mum with her, and things were seemingly fine for a bit. Until one day, my mum and uncle, let's call him Steve, went out for a drive in their fancy, at the time, Mustang. They were driving all around Rome, and then they got to a highway that was pretty empty at the time. My uncle was going a little bit over the speed limit, 70 miles per hour if I'm remembering the story correctly, and then it happened. The car just flipped. There was literally nothing there. They were driving straight on an empty highway, and the car just completely flipped over. My Uncle Steve actually died that day, but my mum survived, and this made my grandpa quit acting and move back with my grandpa. My grandma and grandpa decided to settle down in the Midwest and bought a pleasantly large house with my grandpa's pharmacist income. Things didn't get better after this, though. The house was constantly burdened with strange figures, things going missing, dogs being scared by seemingly nothing, and even the piano playing by itself. But that wasn't even the worst part. But one night, my grandma invited some friends over, and as a joke, one of the girls tried a wedding dress on. It actually fit just fine, and as they were making jokes, it suddenly just began constricting. My grandma told me that you could basically see the stitches contracting, getting smaller and smaller around her friend, until her friend just couldn't breathe or move, unlike before when things were fine. My grandma got a pair of scissors and cut the dress off of her, and when the dress fell to her ankles, it flew to the other side of the room, tripping her friend. They managed to grab the dress together and took it down to the fire pit, burning it to ashes, and then my family would just go on to experience even more unexplainable atrocities. Family members just suddenly experiencing depression, suicide, dying from unexplainable causes, and the same figures, things going missing, everything just like before. My dad ended up dying a couple of years ago, and it was strange how I watched him go from just a completely normal good dad to an alcoholic and then just dead. It was like something was just feeding him the alcohol and destroying him from within. Now that I live on my own with my fiancée, I do still see things. I see shadow figures nearly every day, usually several times a day. I've heard people talking to me before while I was home alone, and have had things mess with my animals too. I have 3 parrots, and they seem to pick up words and noises and songs that I don't say around them. They are also horrified of the dark, which is strange because 2 of the parrots are my fiancé's, and they've never had this fear up until living with me. And I guess that I'm pretty afraid for the future, and so is my fiancée. My fiancée had never had paranormal experiences up until being with me, and it strained our relationship a couple of times for sure. I'll send you guys some updates and probably get to posting some other old stories that I have too, but for now, thanks for listening.